Hello and welcome back, guys. Glad to see you around. Make yourselves comfortable and enjoy. This is Book of the Dead, Chapter 145. The Awakening. Tyron Steelum. Your mastery of your craft has advanced by leaps and bounds, proving your choice of ascension was a wise one. Your soul burns with hunger. Now you shall fashion an army to feed it. You are ascending. Plus 20 to all stats. You are able to advance mysteries to the next stage. You have received the class, Lord of the Ossuary, a perfectionist focused on achieving the peak of performance with one form of undead. A Lord of the Ossuary can create the ultimate skeletal warriors, and more. To advance, raise skeletal minions and have them fight in your name. Class attributes per level: Strength +2, Dexterity +2, Constitution +3, Intelligence +3, Wisdom +2, Willpower +2, Manipulation +2, Poise +3. The maximum skill limit of Raise Dead has been increased to 40. Your knowledge of this ritual has been expanded. You may now apply it to horses. Your knowledge of this ritual has been expanded. You may now engrave spells upon the minds of your skeletal minions. The maximum skill limit of Bone Soul Melding has been increased to 20. The maximum skill limit of Bone Forging has been increased to 20. The maximum skill limit of Bone Animus has increased to 40. Through your feats, you have been granted a new mystery. Your insights into death magic and the properties of this energy have unlocked. Essence of Death. At the initial stage, the rush of power was so intense that he could no longer stand. He crumpled to the floor, legs quivering as his body and mind underwent another grand transformation. Some time later, Tyron shivered. The strength given to him by the unseen since his awakening was nothing to sneeze at. But his second advancement still hit him pretty hard. An additional 20 to all of his attributes, 180 points in total, rocked him to his core to the point he had collapsed to the floor, but still conscious, unlike his early levels. The further he rose, the more he left normal humanity behind. In normal circumstances, he would now be classified as a silver-ranked slayer. For most people, that was as high a rank as they would ever reach. Compared to the average citizen, who didn't have the advantage of the power granted to combat focus classes, his current status page would look like something out of legend. At 62, he was already stronger than a human had any right to be, his muscles tense with power. In his old village, perhaps only Rufus's father, the blacksmith, would still be stronger than he was, despite him hardly getting any points in it from his classes. With over 100 dexterity, he had cleared the first threshold, able to control the movements of his body with unearthly precision. A useful trait for casters to have to help them cast spells and rituals that required gestures. For Tyron, it was all about his finger control. Carving runes, weaving thread, casting rituals, he needed all the fine motor dexterity he could get. He sat up and wiggled his fingers, chuckling at the strange sensation he got as he did so. With both hands in front of his face, he experimented, bending each digit to different angles, forming shapes, first mimicking the movements on both hands, then moving them separately. How much better would he be able to do his work now? Of all of his physical properties, his constitution was by far the highest, nearly reaching the second threshold and 200. Although he hadn't been in a fight recently, he could still tell his body was hardening. He no longer cut himself by accident. Paper couldn't slice through him. The sharp edges of his tools didn't penetrate his hardened skin. Even Folletta remarked at just how hard it was to make a mark on him. Illness was almost a distant memory, and his ability to endure the harsh conditions he placed on himself, poor diet, lack of rest, was always rising. Which probably wasn't a good thing. He chuckled to himself. Once again, Tyron made a note to try and take better care of himself. It was hard to do once he got absorbed in something, but it was important even if he could survive it. His intelligence had almost reached the third threshold, his highest attribute. He had long grown used to the difference it made, sharpening his memory, accelerating his decision-making, and more importantly, increasing the store of magic at his command. Still seated on the cold stone floor of his study, he took a deep breath and held it, focusing on the well of arcane power that dwelt within his body. It was this source that would eventually turn all who dwelt in this realm to kin, he knew, but even so, he rejoiced to feel it swollen with energy, more than he had ever felt before. At this point, he was confident that the magic battery feats he had taken were not a flat increase to his capacity. but rather increase the amount of magic his body could hold per point of intelligence. That was what he'd hoped for, but couldn't confirm it was true before making the selection. The realization sent a wave of relief rushing through him, and he threw back his head and laughed. Wisdom, close to the second threshold, was his second highest attribute. Who knows why the unseen designed things this way, but it divided the attributes of all who fell under its reach into physical, mental and social groups, and then divided those three into power, control and resistance. Tyrant's physical power was low, but his control and resistance were comparatively very high. His mental power was absurd, his control lagging behind, and his resistance was the lowest of the three, though still high. That control eased the difficulty he felt wrestling his vast reserve of magic to do as he wished, easing spellcasting to the point where his early struggles felt like a distant memory. There was no ritual or spell Tyrant currently knew that challenged him at all. Bending the magic to his will, holding his nerve, maintaining precise movement of his hands and clear diction of his voice, were easier than they had ever been. Socially, he was still relatively weak and vulnerable to manipulation. Those with extremely high social attributes were dangerous to be around, especially if they had the skills and feats to match. Most people refused to shop from a merchant or store that employed such an individual, as they could be persuaded to part with almost anything they owned without realizing what was happening. Many professional musicians and bards, who traveled the provinces entertaining the people, were accompanied by a guard at all times. With their powers of persuasion, they could create an uprising, or convince blushing milkmaids or strapping farmhands into doing things they would later regret. Not that Tyrant would ever have the capacity to do such things. He manipulated minds in a rather more direct fashion. He would always be weak socially. That didn't bother him. He needed to do more to ensure he wasn't vulnerable to it. However, the last thing he wanted was to be talked down by someone as he sought to enact his vengeance. The rest of the changes were eye-opening. The additions to his Raise Dead ritual were staggering, especially the last part. Being able to raise horses made some kind of sense. Skeletons on skeletal horses. Sure, why not? Engraving spells on their minds. What did that mean? Could he create skeletons who could use magic? Skeleton mages. That would be absurd. How could he possibly supply enough energy to minions such as those? Or would he have to, with his enchanting arrays, but scaled up? Perhaps he could figure something out. Tyrant shook his head. It was too early to think on that. He tried to focus on the present. All of his bone-related skills and spells had their maximum levels increased, which was to be expected. If he raised them to the cap once again, his proficiency with skeletal minions would reach another peak altogether. That thought alone was enough to get him excited. And who knew what powerful skills, spells and feats would be available at this rank? Only his main class could go beyond level 40 and give him real power. And now he was finally able to realize this potential. The necromancer pushed himself from the floor and stood, a little wobbly at first, but his balance returned steadily with each moment that passed. New ideas were already bubbling away in his brain as the knowledge and impressions the unseen had imprinted there began to surface, but he pushed them away. It was too soon. Over the next few days and weeks, those concepts would settle, and he could examine them at his leisure then. For now, he had other priorities. To help himself acclimate to his new body, Tyrant began to walk in slow circles through his study, his hands trailing over the cold stone slabs, free of remains for the time being. It was hard to focus. He was so full of energy, so full of drive. He wanted to rush out of his store, wanted to return to what it had been like before, out on the rifts with his minions, fighting against the tide of kin. In combat, he would quickly reap levels, doing what a necromancer should, growing quickly in the face of death. But he couldn't, not so soon as that. There was so much to do. The shop couldn't be abandoned, nor could his persona as Lucas Armsfield. It was bearing surprising fruit, after all. He'd been contacted several times about helping with commissions for high-ranking families, and even the magisters had come calling, screening him for their services. Coming face to face with a true noble had been unexpected and dangerous, but access to people of that rank was precious. If he was to plan his vengeance, it would also help him if he was to support the growing rebellion from the shadows. No, he would leave to fight and train his abilities, but it would have to be carefully planned. As he was wont to do in such hectic moments, Tyrant reached for paper and a pen and began to write. "You want how many?" Folletta squawked. Tyrant pulled his shirt on and buttoned it carefully. Being honest. As many as you can get, but at a bare minimum. I need 100 over the next 2 months. Still tangled in the sheets, the thief rolled from the bed and began to rummage for her own clothes. You really think it's that simple for us to find fresh corpses? This surprised the necromancer. I thought there would be far more than 100 deaths in and around Kenmore in a week, let alone a month. Folletta rolled her eyes in the dark. Yes, obviously. The city has millions of people in it. There are tens of thousands of deaths every year. The issue isn't finding dead people, it's smuggling. We need to spirit the remains away and replace them with something before they go into the fire. What do you use? Tyron asked, curious. Cow parts, so I'm told. She shrugged. I don't handle that end of things. I'm more of a customer relations expert, she leered. Now it was time for Tyron to roll his eyes. Fine, I'll pay extra, obviously. And I'll need more regular shipments of bones as well. More bones as well. Why the rush? The faster we move, the greater the risk of discovery. You know that, right? Tyron finished with his shirt and began to pull on his coat. Of course I know that. This is a temporary matter. Once I have the 100, we can slow the pace for a time to dissipate any heat that might have accumulated. Folletta nodded slowly. Very well. I'll talk to my people and we'll do what we can. I'm grateful. Tyron nodded, then turned and pushed open the door, stepping out into the corridor. Another 100 minions should suffice to start with, but he would need more in his fight against the rifts. Unfortunately, there was a limit to how many he could gather in the city without drawing suspicion. He may have to purchase a few shovels. Grave robbing might be back in fashion. Chapter 146. I can't believe you've already reached your second advancement, Elsbeth pouted. Just how much have you been grinding? Tyron raised a brow and took a sip from his cup, a wry smile twisting his lips. Can you blame me for being driven? All things considered. His old friend sighed and shook her head, looking sad. No, I suppose not. She looked as if she wanted to say something, but ultimately restrained herself with a shake of her head. Well, it's still a good thing you managed to reach this point, she said, looking for the positives. Are you planning to celebrate? Some sort of party? The necromancer looked at her as if she were crazy. Of course not. You want me to wave a banner and announce I'm a level 40 necromancer? Well, you have a fake first class, right? You could pretend you advanced in that. Then I would have to get branded, he told her acidly. On my documents, I'm a curse mage, which is a registered combat class. Oh, that's right, she sighed, deflated. She rested her cheek on her hand, looking glum. It would have been nice if we got to celebrate something for you. It's not like you can celebrate advances in your class openly, Tyron observed wryly. Or do they welcome priestesses of the old gods in the taverns and restaurants these days? In some of them, they do, she replied seriously. I reached my first advancement 2 years ago, and the other priests arranged a gathering for me. It was fun. I'm not really bothered by it, he said. She pounded the table. But I am. Calm down and drink your tea, he scolded her. We're supposed to be talking about revolution and uprisings, not advancement parties. Fine. She harumphed and took a quick nibble on her pastry to calm herself. It's taking time to connect everyone together. There's always been a loose association between pockets of believers, but never a firm, reliable network. The gods are taking an active role now for the first time since possibly ever, so connecting all the groups and establishing lines of communication is happening faster than I would have thought possible. This was big news. The old gods actually doing something. He could only imagine how shaken the believers were. How have your fellow clergy taken this change in divine policy? Tyron wondered, a twinkle in his eye. Elsbeth frowned at him. I know you don't really like them, but they're gods, Tyron. Try to show a little respect. And the change has been met with confusion for the most part. You'd think they'd be happy their gods are taking a more active role in the realm. Then you don't know the old gods as well as you think, she snorted. Drawing their gaze can be a blessing or a curse, and it's a flip of the coin which one it's going to be. Just because the three are being active doesn't mean they're being helpful. It could be quite the opposite. That was sadly true. From what Tyron knew, drawing the gaze of crone, raven or rot was celebrated amongst the faithful to an extent. Rebellions against the nobles and the magisters have never succeeded before, but they've never had the support of the true divinities either. The old gods aren't going to smash the empire to pieces, but they're willing to assist their clergy and followers. This is a momentous step. That's something worth thinking about, Tyron muttered. If the old gods wanted the empire to fall, they could do it easily, most likely. How much can the 5 divines resist them? Can they really just do what they like? Elsbeth made a face. Nobody can answer that question. The old gods would laugh and say they can tear them apart with a thought, but who knows if that's true. Perhaps they can do that, but don't because they want the mortals to rise up and throw the false gods down, or because they want them to suffer as their power is slowly stripped away. Or perhaps they can't do it and are just lying. Or that. Personally, I think it's the suffering angle. They can be extremely vengeful, I've no doubt. At any rate, Elsbeth pressed her palms to the wooden table. The center of this rebellion is going to be at Cragwhistle. What? Why? Cragwhistle was as far from civilization as one could get, which might be the point, but that distance and isolation would make a lot of things difficult. There's a rift, and almost no magister control, Elsbeth shrugged. And the old gods have been gathering followers there for years. You wouldn't recognize the place now if you saw it. A lot has changed, I bet. It's probably the best place for me to hunt as well, Tyron mused, considering the lack of magisters and slayers. Only problem is, it would take weeks to get there, and weeks to get back. He pondered the issue for a moment before he noticed Elsbeth shifting uncomfortably in her seat. The two of them were together in Tyron's upstairs rooms above the shop, protected by wardings that dampened sound and prevented scrying. What's wrong with you? He asked after a moment. The bathroom is through that door. I don't need the bathroom, she blushed. I was just thinking on whether or not I should share a thought I'd had. Tyron leaned forward, intrigued. Well, you're going to have to share it. Now you've got me interested. I suppose, she sighed. She fell silent for a moment. Obviously, reaching Cragwhistle would be difficult for you, and for your minions. But there is a way you could travel that distance much faster. Elsbeth, where did you learn about this method? The young mage asked with narrow eyes. From Raven, she replied hesitantly. Is it dangerous? He asked slowly. It is, she replied, slowly averting her gaze. What do they want me to do? He gave in. I didn't want to tell you this, she defended herself, looking him in the eye. I was against it, but Raven insisted. And he's loud. To be honest, I was surprised they suggested it in the first place. Elsbeth, just tell me what it is. She drew a deep breath, and then the words tumbled out of her in a rush. You called Trevelthrith Abyss. Tyron blinked. What? The Abyss? That's a great idea and also a terrible one. She averted her gaze. You know what it would cost to do something like this. Clearly, she herself was aware. Raven must have told her. I've paid the price before, he told her, more coldly than he'd intended, and she flinched. No matter how far they'd come from where they'd begun, she still thought of him as who he'd been back in Foxbridge. He was not that person anymore. Congratulations, you smiled, showing more than a hint of fang. You've reached your goal. That is to be commended. I presume that means you will be taking a more active role in securing your vengeance. Tyron tried to ignore the swaying walls and faint hint of intoxicating smoke that remained in the air, or the sounds of music and other things that still reached his ears. Is there any particular reason you insist a meeting be held here? He asked flatly. I find the atmosphere conducive to relaxing and productive conversation. No, you don't, he snorted. I can tell you're practically blood drunk. You know how much I hate coming here. That's the reason. Perhaps that's the case. It's an interesting theory. Regardless, you agree to meet here at the Red Pavilion, and that is what we shall continue to do. The young mage glanced around the room, sensing with more than just his eyes. Is this room properly secured? He queried. I can never tell how strong your wards are. The vampire leaned back and stretched, pulling her sheer black dress tight across chest. That's the key to a good defense. If someone sees a fortress, then they know you have something you want to protect. If they see a little rabbit hole, they won't suspect a thing. Tyron was about to protest that no defense was hardly a good defense, but she held up a finger and pierced him with her blood-red gaze. If they stick their hand in the bunny hole, then it gets bitten off. A powerful defense disguised as one that is weak. It made sense. He should take notes. Fine. I have a few things I want to discuss. Oh, can I expect another transaction to take place? How interesting. He grimaced, but didn't deny it. There were many ways to get what he needed, but none of them were attractive. The reason he'd become a Forbidden One was so he could trade favors with his 3 dark patrons. hopefully without any of them getting their fingers on his soul. He'd been successful so far. Right now, he needed the favor of the abyss, and he knew of only one method to get it. From the seat beside him, Tyron picked up a small chest similar to a jewelry box and placed it on the table. Yor leaned forward with interest as he opened it, only to appear disappointed to see nothing but small glass spheres inside. Is this a new fashion? She wondered. It's different. No, Tyron shook his head. Fashion? How did her head work? These are vessels. I need souls. She immediately knew what he wanted. You think we are going to help you pay one of our rivals? She grinned. How wicked. I think you would rather I owed you a favor than them. I can't get what I need to fill these. He gestured to the spheres. But you can. That wasn't entirely true. He could get the spirits required, but it would be difficult. Difficult and unpleasant. Collecting them in the city would be impossible. He couldn't be wandering the streets conducting dark rituals to bind souls every time he stumbled across a dead beggar. Gaining access to the spirits of the recently deceased right under the noses of the priests and priestesses who served the 5 divines would also be an absurd risk. No, he would need to leave the city for an extended period of time to gather what he needed, and even that wouldn't be without risks. His only other alternative would be to go through Folletta and her crew, but he suspected they would balk at bringing him a few dozen people and slaughtering them in front of him. After all, the spirits were bound to the place of death, not the corpse. He got none at all from the bodies they brought him. For Tyron to gather the souls he needed, people would have to die. Then he would take their spirits and feed them to the amorphous horrors that lived outside the fabric of this reality. It was a nightmarish, terrible thing he was going to do, but he was still going to do it. Bring me the spirits, and I will bind them myself, he said. I know your coven doesn't exactly have clean hands. You won't need to do anything you aren't already doing, except give me the souls of those you've killed. It's true there is the odd feeding accident among other business you're admitted freely, but this favor is still a costly one. I hope you're prepared to pay the price. I'll get a loan from the old gods, he shrugged. They seem quite well disposed to me at present. Yor's eyes narrowed. You're playing a dangerous game if you continue to beg favors from each in turn. If we believe you will go to the others for payment, we will ask for something they won't want to give up. And what position will that leave you in? If you think dealing with us is hard, you can only imagine how painfully we deal with each other. Chapter 147. You have to hone your concentration further. I'm sorry. I struggle to maintain my focus for long periods of time. Tyron compared the scripting he'd had his apprentice, Flynn, complete over the past 5 hours. As time stretched on, they grew progressively worse, small errors creeping in by the 3-hour mark. It's something you must improve at if you want to be able to work in this field as a master of the craft, he told him. Being able to produce flawless sigils, hour after hour, is the hallmark of the trade. I'm sorry. Flynn hung his head in shame, but Tyron just tapped him on the shoulder, so he would look up again. It's not an insurmountable problem. Most apprentices struggle with this. Too many focus on trying to produce a flawless enchantment and then stop once they've succeeded. It isn't enough to create work without errors. You have to be able to do 9 times out of 10 for 8 hours at a time. The level of mastery is completely different. So what should I do? To improve, I mean. His master pulled open a drawer filled with cores. Practice. Have a routine to sharpen your focus and shake off distractions before working on a core. Don't accept anything less than a perfect result. Then repeat until you can't do it anymore. If you continue to repeat this practice, your endurance and precision will increase. If you'll forgive me, Master Armsfield, when should I do this? I don't want to interfere in the normal running of the shop. Tyron almost responded with skip sleep and do it at night, but closed his mouth at the last possible moment. Flynn wasn't like him and, like most people, lacked his nocturnal habits and obsessive drive. He considered the question. I'll give you 2 days off per week for the next few months, so you can devote them to improving your skills and focus. You can have free use of the store's supply of cores as well. Only the chips, of course. Chips refer to the lowest grade of cores, not even large enough to form a full sphere inside their monstrous host. Instead, they were a shard, a sliver of crystal that could be difficult to work with, along with having poor power absorption. They were readily abundant, found in the smallest and most common types of kin, but had little use in traditional enchanting. Most of the time, they'd be used as a reagent in alchemical mixtures, or fused together to create a crude form of mage candy. Flynn's face fell when he learned he'd have to work with the difficult gems, and Tyron relented enough to tell him why. Working with chips forces you to be extra precise with your sigil work and spacing. If you don't concentrate on applying your knowledge and skills, then it won't work. Too many apprentices get comfortable and lazy, performing the basic enchantments by rote without considering the implications. The irregular surface of the chips meant that even if you were applying the same enchantment to 10 of them, you would have to adjust it 10 times to fit each specific one. Despite the difficulty of the task, Flynn's expression firmed, and he resolved himself to the work. Thank you for the extra lessons lately, Master Armsfield. I know how busy you are. Tyron scratched at his cheek, feeling slightly guilty. Yes, there's been a lot to do, and I'll be leaving for a trip in a few months. But while we have time, I'll do what I can to help. You've been a good apprentice, and I don't want you to feel neglected. At this unexpected praise from his young teacher, Flynn smiled happily. However, I would appreciate it if you stopped flirting with my clerk in front of the customers. Sorry. What's a sword, anyway? At what point does it qualify as a sword? Tyron threw the sharpened bone he'd been working onto the stone floor of his study. You are asking the wrong fucking guy, Dove replied, bending down to pick it up and swishing it through the air a few times. Seems fine to me. It's got some heft, seems to cut, the edge appears to be sharp. What else do you want? The necromancer threw his hands into the air and paced back and forth. I'm never going to learn the sword crafting skill now, so I'll never know if I've actually achieved a satisfactory level in the eyes of the unseen. Which means you won't know when you've actually succeeded, Dove mused, understanding. This is only a problem for moronic perfectionists like you. In all likelihood, you succeeded weeks ago. How many hundreds of these stupid things are you going to make? I'll keep going until I'm satisfied. Tyron snapped back. The walls were covered in notes, diagrams, excerpts from texts, and a dozen metal blades leaned against the stone slabs around the room. There were swords of all sorts, falchions, rapiers, short swords, long swords, even a two-handed bastard sword. Will you ever be satisfied? Dove asked skeptically. Until you produce a masterwork blade and get a mystery or something, you'll never stop. If it's made from bone, can cut and stab, do you really need to give a shit beyond that? To demonstrate, the former summoner executed some clumsy thrusts and parries, whipping the sword through the air, and enjoying the satisfying swoosh sound it made. He was so bad even Tyron could point out the flaws in his technique. I was satisfied with my progress on the spears and shields he defended himself. He was not some obsessive maniac who didn't know when to quit. Dove laughed sarcastically. Those are spears and shields, he mocked. All you had to do for a spear was make a pointy bit you could attach to the end of a stick. There's a reason they're considered the poor person's weapon. As for the shield, as soon as you made something you could hit without it breaking, you'd done your job. Swords are a different matter. I've seen swordsmen who literally slept with theirs, the kinky fuckers. They have to have the right weight. They have to have a cutting edge and sharp tip. They need to be perfectly balanced. The shape needs to be right. The curve of the blade, if there is one. There's a million different ways to make the fucking things, and each has its own merits. People get obsessed with finding the perfect one, and the amount of money slayers will spend to get a hold of their dream blade is absurd. Tyron found it difficult to relate to them. His father, the most renowned swordsman in the province, perhaps ever, hadn't given a shit when it came to his weapons. He collected them in a sense, but he'd only had one requirement when it came to the blade he bore into combat. As long as it doesn't break when I swing it, I'm happy, he would laugh, weighing a blade in his hand. When you get to my level, that's a tall order. Most swords shatter. Keep the fancy enchanting rubbish away from me. It just gets in the way. Magnan had favored simple longswords that allowed for a two-handed grip, giving him flexibility to swing with extra power when he wanted to. Straightforward in design and make, all he'd had to worry about was finding materials strong enough to withstand him and a smith capable of forging them. If it was good enough for Magnan Steelum, it was good enough for Tyron. He stood up and grabbed hold of a new set of femurs, infusing them with death magic the moment he touched them. With a determined expression, he began to fuse and mold the bones, as familiar now with the basic components of a sword as a smith. He molded the fuller, hardened the edge to the limit of his ability, then did the same for the point. He used a shoulder blade, or scapula, to create the hilt as a separate piece. Modifications were necessary, of course. A traditional longsword was a flexible and versatile weapon, but would be difficult for his skeletons to wield shoulder to shoulder, so he shortened it a hand. This was probably a good idea anyway. To properly create a bone weapon that long, he would have needed to include even more raw material, cutting into his dwindling supply. When it was done, he took the blade and connected it to the hilt, checking the grip before he tried a few test swipes. The balance was good, which surprised him. That was where he failed the most often. "Looks good," Dove complimented his work, stepping closer to inspect the blade. "Let's assume that this design is good enough. Practice it a few more times, and then can we please move on with our fucking lives?" Tyron stretched his back, groaning. Nearby, wiping down the display cases, Seri chuckled at his display. "You sound like an old man, Master Armsfield. My grandfather does exactly the same thing at the end of a day." "I am old," he told her seriously, "old in spirit. Now my body is finally catching up." "I think you've just been working too hard," she chided him, then pouted. "Even Flynn has been locked up in the workshop the last few days. You two are going to fall over dead at this rate. Apprentice Rivner is working hard to succeed in his lessons so he can graduate and become a full arcanist. There will be time for your dates when he's done." Tyron chided her, causing the girl to flush. "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it," she protested, but he just waved her off. Back to cleaning. "He'll be down soon enough." Chastised, she went back to polishing the glass display cases until they gleamed. The various products nestled on their cushions within, labeled with a note written in flawless calligraphy. Those notes had cost a small fortune, Tyron recalled. Those who had truly mastered the art of decorative writing were few and charged well for their services. It was worth it, though. Each letter was like a painting, drawing the eye. The past few weeks, Tyron had been working himself ruthlessly hard, ensuring the store was well managed and supplied as business continued to grow, along with his nocturnal production work. Minions didn't create themselves after all, and Folletta had delivered on his request. For the next while, he could expect regular deliveries of remains, and he had a lot of work to do to get one batch out the door before the next arrived. As dusk fell, there was little business in the shop, which meant he was a touch surprised when the bell rang over the door. He turned to the entrance to see someone he hadn't expected. Seri flinched and shifted herself to another cabinet away from the door, as the heavily robed and cowled form he recognized as Shada entered the shop. He gestured to Wansa to put her weapon away as he stepped forward. "Greetings. It's been some time." The dust folk shuffled into the store, face hidden. "Human, Shada has returned, yes. My tribe is happy with what you sold." "Much praise for Shada. Some for you." "A little. And so cheap." "A little knowledge. This is easy, yes." Tyron blinked. Obviously, his work had gone over well in the desert. That was comforting to know. "Let's go into the back room to talk. We escape the prying eyes. I learn." "Ah, good." Soon they were seated, and the dust folk was eager to get down to business. The moisture condensers, they work so well, on so little magic. "My Gruul, my leader, chief, is close, yes. My chief is very pleased. We want more, twice as much as last time." "The same terms as last time, then?" Tyron inquired. "What you procured for me was very interesting, and I would love to learn more." "Chanrella, of course." Shada has come prepared. From within the robes emerged a slim, bound volume, possibly only a few dozen pages. Tyron seized it eagerly. 2 days, he assured Shada. "Come back in 2 days, and I'll have everything you need." Chapter 148. The carriage rattled across the worn cobblestone road, with 4 wagons in train behind it. Tyron looked back over his shoulder to make sure they were keeping pace as he'd instructed, and was pleased to note that they were. "Our stop is coming up," he told the driver. "Right you are, sir. I know where we's going," the gruff man replied, his face more beard than anything else. At this late hour, darkness had fallen over Shade Town. There were few people about, and most houses weren't lit, their residents sleeping comfortably. Occasionally, someone stuck their head out a window and swore down at the carriages for making such noise so far from the main road. "Here we are," then the driver said, pulling back on the reins and slowing the horses to a stop. A warehouse loomed to their left, 4 men on the door, faces shrouded in the night. Tyron dismounted the carriage and approached them. "Good evening to you all. Apologies for the late hour. Are you prepared to load the wagons?" One of them leaned over and spat on the street. Course, we're ready. It's fucking late, let's get on with it. Tyron glared at him. Make sure you move my cargo with care. Rudeness, I will tolerate. Sloppy work, I will not. Something in his gaze warned the porter not to try his luck, and before long, the men were working in pairs, bringing out box after box, and sliding them onto the wagons. Tyron watched impatient as the process went on until each of the wagons was stacked 4 boxes high, and then lashed down with solid rope and a thick covering. Hope that's to your satisfaction, the man grizzled. Tyron flashed gold in his hand. Is this to yours? He replied. Greed flickered in his gaze as he reached for the coin. Tyron seized his wrist in a powerful grip, forcing the hand down, then placed the coin carefully in his palm. The same again next time, he said. Without looking back, he turned and mounted the carriage once more, closing the door behind him. We can go, he informed the driver, and with a click of his tongue, he had the horses moving again. They made frequent stops on the journey, not for any practical reason, but mainly for Tyron to inspect his precious boxes, and ensure they hadn't been disturbed or damaged. The driver complained, but he settled the man with extra coin for the delay. The trip was much slower than when he traveled alone, but that was to be expected. It was 4 days before they arrived at the Orton estate, and by that time Tyron was stiff and irritable from sitting in the carriage for so long. As usual, Rita Orton greeted him as the wagons pulled up outside the manor. Welcome, Master Arnsfield, she said, barely concealing her sarcasm at the use of his name. He scowled at her. Hello to you as well, Mrs. Orton. I take it you received my letter. I did. She cast her eyes over the wagons laden with the odd, rectangular boxes. It seems you've been busy. There was clear disgust on her face, and Tyron felt a true spark of anger ignite. Could this woman not contain her emotions at all? If you're done being obvious about what I'm doing here, perhaps you could take yourself elsewhere before you get all of us murdered by the Magisters in our sleep. She scoffed at his blunt warning, but the heat in his words gave her enough pause that she made an effort at least. I take it your driver and wagoners will need lodgings and food? She asked with stiff dignity. They will, he nodded, and I will reimburse you for the cost. So you should, she sniffed. The Venerable would like to see you while you are here on the estate. I'm sure he would, Tyron said flatly, but if he wants to chat, then he needs to come to me. I'm going to be busy. She rounded on him in anger, but he coldly met her gaze. This is not an appointed meeting time, he reminded her. I am not obliged to meet him. I'm sure he is spry enough to make his way down to the basement. So saying, he turned back and instructed the men to begin unloading the wagons, stacking the boxes meticulously under his supervision by the basement entrance before they were dismissed for the night. No longer required. The wagons could leave in the morning. Only the carriage and driver needed to stay the full 2 days before Tyron was ready to leave again. It was deep into the evening by the time everything was done to his satisfaction, and the workers could finally retire, yawning broadly as they stumbled off. Despite his fatigue, the necromancer knew he wouldn't be able to sleep, not without magic anyway. He was far too excited. He trailed his hands along the smooth wood of the boxes, pleased with the quality and finish on them. Most crates of this sort were crude, not designed to last, but these were solid, the wood expertly cut and treated to resist the elements. Waterproof, they protected the precious cargo within from wind and rain, while inside, they were lined with enchantments to prevent the leakage and detection of death magic. He'd even designed them to be open from within, preventing anyone from prying at their contents. He waited an hour for everyone to settle on the grounds before he began to unpack. Starting at the uppermost containers, there was a series of clicking sounds as his skeletons reached out their fingers and undid the clasps, then pushed the crates open from within. It was a ghastly sight, several sets of skeletal arms reaching out from within the boxes. But Tyron was delighted. 3 skeletons per crate, they emerged and shifted their own containers before he ordered them down into the basement, pressing themselves tight against the wall. It was going to be a tight fit in there. Layer by layer, the skeletons rose, then made way for the next group before they marched down the steps, their bones clacking against the stone steps. Tyron's eyes gleamed with pride as he watched them move. These were his finest creations, each representing the accumulated effort and knowledge he had compiled since becoming a necromancer. They were stronger, faster, more durable, more efficient. In fact, as they moved and shifted the crates, he felt barely any drain on his magic at all, causing him to grin. When all his new minions had finally removed themselves, only the final few boxes remained. These were opened in a more conventional manner to reveal stacks of swords, shields, spears, bows and arrows which were removed, carted down into the basement, and distributed amongst the skeletons according to his will. Those with the weakest bones had been assigned as archers to keep them away from the thick of the fighting. These skeletons were also the lightest, able to move deceptively fast and with surprising grace. The heaviest skeletons with the most durable bones were his front line, large bone shields on one arm, spears on the other. Those in the middle were his swordsmen, long swords forged of bone gripped in both skeletal hands held in front of their faces. Tyron admired his new soldiers, checking on their intricate arrays, weaponry and connection to himself. All he needed now was to bulk out the numbers of basic skeletons, and enlist a few revenants to his cause. With a thought, he summoned his one remaining revenant, the nameless swordsman he had fought so long ago. Covered in dust after so long in the cellar, he looked very much the worse for wear. Tyron examined the undead carefully, then probed it with his mind. Even now, after years had passed, there was still an undercurrent of resentment and rebellion simmering beneath the surface. When he had bound the soul of the Slayer, there had clearly been a mistake, since his minions should not be able to harbor this much ill will towards him. Thanks to what he had learned from Yor's book, Tyron knew how to fix that now, but wasn't sure if he should. "You're outdated," he told the revenant, gesturing to his new undead. "Things have changed a great deal since you were made. Not to fear, though, I can fix you up. You'll be fit to serve again soon." A flash of rage, a despairing wail, then silence as Tyron enforced his will. "Once upon a time, I might have set you free, but not now, not with everything I need to accomplish." He pushed past the revenant and cast light, revealing the line of stones resting on a dusty wooden shelf. "I don't care about your despair anymore, or your suffering, or your pain. So you will serve. All of you will serve." Beneath the shelf sat another row of small, labeled boxes. He reached out and grasped the one labeled Rufus. Inside, he found the bones, traces of rotten flesh still clinging to the remains, a leering skull, hastily fused back together, resting atop the pile. The Venerable found him in the morning, hard at work. Tyron had remained in the basement all night, pulling apart his old minions, and putting them back together again as best he could. Coughing as he stepped into the damp air choked with dust, the old man blinked as his eyes adjusted to the gloom. "Are you favored of rot, boy?" he asked, querulous. "My lungs are going to grow mold if I stay down here another 10 minutes. "Then feel free to leave," came a voice from near the back of the cellar, and the Venerable grumbled to himself. "At least come over and help me down the steps," he demanded, his thin voice resonating in the narrow stone cellar. "Don't you have a cane for that?" Tyron's voice drifted from the darkness. "It's not enough at my age." "How old are you again?" "That's none of your business." "Fine," Tyron snapped. "Wait there a second." The young mage strode from the recesses of the cellar, his face creased in a scowl, his hair and clothes covered in cobwebs and dust. "You could have cleaned the place before you started working here," the Venerable said, his thin voice hardly penetrating the dust-choked air. "I don't have much time, and it takes more than a little dust to bother my constitution," Tyron replied as he stepped forward briskly. With care, he helped the old man down the steps, and the Venerable took in the sight of the many skeletons lined against the walls. "Weapons made of bones. Looks like you've been progressing well," he noted as he peered at a sword. The skeleton snapped its head towards him, and the Venerable chuckled. "Takes more than that to scare an old dog like me." Tyron shrugged, somewhat impatient. He only had 2 days in which to update his old minions as best he could and create new revenants. He wanted Rufus to be one of them, but his skeleton still needed a lot of repair work after what Magnan had done to him. "I was told you wanted to talk, but I hope you forgive me if I continue to work while you speak," Tyron said, bending down to the pile of bones he was currently rethreading. The musculature on his old minions was totally inadequate. He was lucky they'd even been able to walk. The Venerable nodded agreeably, watching with interest as the necromancer's fingers began to dance through the air with impossible speed and grace, fine threads of magic trailing from his fingertips. "You've come a long way," the Venerable said. "I'm a bit surprised. Seems like you haven't been wasting your time down in the capital." The younger man flicked an irritated glance at the older as he continued to move with dizzying speed. You think my desire for vengeance is so weak the comforts of the city would be enough to snuff it out? He scoffed. You don't know me, old man. I'm desperate enough to throw in with your gods to get what I want. Underestimate my drive at your own peril. The venerable didn't respond immediately, continuing to watch him spin his threads into muscle and sinew. The gods seem to think you have a chance to succeed, he finally said, quietly. I haven't seen the three put their faith in anyone like this for a long time. I hope you are worthy of it. It was difficult, but Tyron managed to suppress the urge to spit out a deprecating or sarcastic reply. Worthy? He didn't care about being worthy. Whatever Crone, Raven and Rot had in mind certainly wasn't for his benefit, but their own. The venerable seemed to sense his mood. Even if you don't care about the three, then spare a thought for their followers, he urged quietly. At the behest of their gods, they are sticking their necks out for the first time in centuries. At the very least, try not to let them down. Tyron glared up at the old man. Do you know what's going to happen? If you have details, spit them out. Something great, the old man said, and terrible. It'll come quickly from here. I hope you're ready, boy. Chapter 149. Tyron looked down and let the emotions run through him. Rage, pain, grief, shame. It was difficult to be here. Hard to endure the internal tumult he felt every time he stood in this place. But still he forced himself to. It was here that he renewed his purpose. Magnan and Beery looked the same as they had in life. They were laid next to each other, arms touching, facing the sky above through a gap in the trees. This place was on the edge of the Auden estate, but he wasn't worried anyone would find it, or what they might do if they did. His parents were encased in a clear, ice-like substance as hard as diamonds. Of course, they had arranged for everything when they died, or at least everything they could manage, including the preservation of their own remains. The greatest swordsman of the West had told him that the bodies he and Beery would leave behind would be the best materials he would ever find, and the two of them had taken steps to ensure they would be preserved. He hadn't been wrong. Magnan's soul was gone, his supreme swordsmanship gone with it. But this was the body of someone who had pushed close to level 80, possibly gone beyond it. Tyron deeply hoped he was never forced to a place where he had to make use of it. It wasn't sentimental attachment that prevented him from making use of what his family had left behind, but he didn't believe he had it in him to butcher his own parents. He was simply too weak. Wherever their spirits had gone, he hoped they were happy, finally free of the concerns that had bound them in this place. No more brand, no more demands on their time and energy, just the endless adventure they had craved. They deserved that. Down here, in this place, Tyron would burn everything their killers had built down to the ground. Not for them, Magnan and Beery hadn't wanted him to walk this path. He would do it for himself. Leaning forward, he placed a hand against the cold, clear surface that encased the two figures. For a time, he struggled to think of something to say, anything, but eventually gave up. They weren't here. All that remained was flesh and bone. Anything he said wouldn't reach them, so he didn't bother. He gave them one last look, then turned and left. Tyron's hands ached and a persistent throbbing pounded in his head, but he was satisfied with the work he'd gotten done. Updating his old skeletons to bring them fully in line with his current ones wasn't possible, but he could do a great deal to strengthen them. First, he grouped with the other skeletons they'd been raised with and bound them with the same enchantments the others had. Having prepared the cores and networks ahead of time, all he'd had to do was attach and activate them. Unwinding and fixing the bone stitching was harder. It took more time and required a great deal of dexterous weaving on his part, leaving his fingers pained and stiff, but he'd succeeded in this also. Then he'd repaired their bones, patching up any cracks, and equipped them with his new bone weaponry. After the spruce up, his old skeletons were looking good as new, ready to take on all comers. After which, he'd turned his attention to the more important work. If he was going to take on the rifts, he needed more revenants, and he needed to make them as well as he could. Rufus had been split down the middle by Magnan, and looking at the bones, Tyron still couldn't believe how clean the cut was. He'd done what he could to fuse them back together before departing the mountain, but a proper repair would take time and effort. After ensuring everything was together enough to endure the journey, he carefully packed the remains of the would-be swordsman back into his box, along with the stone that held his soul. When he finished his work, Rufus would have a new home and a new purpose. Laurel was also destined to become a revenant, a talented archer with a great deal of skill. She'd be useful as a minion, more than most anyway. The shield-bearing slayer he'd fought would join them along with the young mage. Tyron wanted to test his ability to create a spell-casting undead, and a mage in training would make an excellent candidate. With those four, he would have 5 former slayers in his service ready to lead his skeletons into battle. They were only iron-ranked, hardly the powerful minions he would prefer, but after he'd given them the full treatment, he expected they would serve their purpose. His work completed and everything packed away, Tyron slumped against the wall. He'd barely made it in time, but soon he would depart. Exhaustion gripped him, and he was covered in dust, but he forced himself to carry his luggage up and out of the cellar, before locking it with almost 200 skeletons inside. Job done, he returned to the manor house for a meal and a bath before the long journey back to Kenmore. Mrs. Orton found him in the kitchen, filching a second slice from a meat pie he'd found cooling on the windowsill. "You don't have to steal," she told him, fists on her hips. "If you ask for a meal, I'll have you served." He shook his head as he chewed, then swallowed. "Not enough time," he said. "I'm leaving in 10 minutes. She shook her head. "You work so fast, I'm surprised you get anything done," she said, looking at his still dust-covered form. "Whatever happened to taking your time and doing your tasks right? Saves time in the long run." Tyron grunted as he choked down another bite. "Turns out," he said, "if you work fast and do it right, you save even more time." The matron barked out a sharp laugh. "Everyone thinks that way, but nobody actually pulls it off. They always end up finding things they overlooked, and having to redo the task all over again. It's the most common pitfall on a farm. People fall for it all the time. There's always more work you could be doing, so the urge to work faster is always there, but it's a trap." He'd heard much the same from Master Willem. The old man could work at incredible speed when he wanted to, but he usually didn't. Tyron had watched him work in one of the rare moments he'd been allowed to observe the master practicing his craft. Willem's movements were never fast and never slow. He worked at a steady, even pace, ensuring that no mistakes occurred at every step, even though he never made any. Tyron swallowed the last of the pie. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. "Any chance I can wash off?" "Please do," Mrs. Orton told him acidly, eyeing her flaws. "Try not to brush against the walls until you're clean." The journey back was quicker than the trip there, and Tyron did his best to sleep the whole way, but still felt exhausted when he finally alighted from the carriage out the front of Armsfield Enchantments. The carriage driver was just as fatigued, having pushed through the journey without break for 2 days. Tyron thanked the man before he personally unloaded the crates he had brought back and placed them in front of the store. "Once, sir," he called as he stuck his head through the door. "I need a little help." The burly slayer stepped outside, and he indicated the boxes. "Can you take these into the back room, please?" She squinted as she stared down at the crates, then at him. "I'm not here to carry your stuff," she told him coldly. "You'll do it anyway," he yawned, "because you know what will happen if you don't." He brushed her off. "Besides," he called over his shoulder, "it's not like I ask you to do this stuff all the time. Help me out." The inside of his store was bustling with an unusual number of customers, who thankfully didn't recognize him. Seri was doing her best to manage the floor, moving from one group to the next, answering their questions as best she could by reading from the ledger containing the specifications of every product they sold. Where the heck was Flynn? The man was supposed to help with sales when it got busy. Tyron slipped through the crowd and behind the counter without Seri spotting him, and made his way upstairs, where he found his apprentice plying his trade in the workshop. "Flynn!" Tyron snapped, and the young man nearly leapt out of his skin. "Seri is getting flooded downstairs. What are you doing?" He stepped forward and peered over his stammering apprentice's shoulder to see the core he'd been working on. Tyron scared. "That's awful. What happened there?" "It was fine until you startled me," Flynn groaned. "My hand slipped." "Couldn't you have knocked?" "I wouldn't have had to if you were doing your job." "The floor." "Now." With a sigh, his apprentice pushed his chair back and rose, placing his pliants down on the bench. "Are you coming, Master Armsfield?" "What?" "No, I'm going to bed." For 3 days, Tyron slept, ate, scrubbed himself and tended to minor chores around the store. He'd been burning the candle at both ends, lately, then inserted an extra wick somewhere in the middle. When he awoke on the 4th day, he felt revived. His head was clear, his eyes weren't grainy, He even looked a little less pale. What a picture of health. Of course, it couldn't last, there was simply too much to do. The first night back, he'd taken his crates and brought them down into the study, carefully unpacking the remains, but then leaving them be. After resting, he was ready to get to work creating his revenants. Of course, as a superior form of undead, they deserved his very best attention, so he lavished it on them. He ran his hands along the bones, sensing for even the slightest imperfection, and repairing them to pristine condition. Each skeleton was treated to remove remaining tissue, cleansed of magic, and then held in the strengthening solution for a full day, the bones soaking up every drop. The series of tests he had developed was carefully applied until he knew every detail of the bones, then he began to modify them. Tyron's newfound capacity to manipulate bones allowed him to make all sorts of modifications, which were never possible before. He strengthened the arms, shoulders, and collarbone, fusing spare material into the skeletons. After treating it, he toughened up the ribsage and skull as well, compressing them to their limits. Armor forge of bone was next. Helmets, shoulder plating, arm guards, dyed black by the infusion of death magic within. He wove an intricate and meticulous thread for each of them, settling it deep within their bones, and pulling the skeletons together. They would have a flawless range of movement and fully articulate hands. Tyron was particularly proud of the spines, which had more flex than any other skeleton, due to the extra weave he'd done there. The bones slowly accumulated death magic as he worked until they approached full saturation, and it was time to finish the job. He took hold of the stone containing the first soul, feeling it weigh heavily in his palm. It was time. Chapter 150. Do you think I deserve this? Laurel's voice echoed from the specter that hovered in the center of the obscuring cloud of mist created by the commune with Spirit's spell. Ghostly eyes filled with rage glared at him, baleful and red. Tyron folded his arms across his chest. You went after a necromancer in the hopes of getting some coin, Laurel. You knew what might happen. You have no reason to keep me. Set me free. Freedom had always been the deepest of Laurel's desires. She didn't want to be controlled. She didn't want to be bound or limited by the circumstances of her birth, or place a limit on her own potential. In many ways, she'd been like his parents, manically devoted to living an unbound life. He couldn't keep a smile from twisting his lips. Freedom. You won't get freedom for a long time, friend. You'll serve instead. The specter screamed, like a wind of death blown straight from a crypt. You want me to apologize? You want me to beg? Tyron only shook his head. Do you think I care about what you did anymore? The only reason we are speaking at all is because I felt like I owed it to you, given the time we spent together. I'm not sure if you can see it in your present state. But look there, your vessel is ready and waiting. The next time we speak, you'll be there, inside your skeleton, bound to serve until I die. I will kill you. No, you won't. The creation of a revenant was something that Tyron had learned without the aid of the unseen. But after all his research and strides forward, he felt that he understood the process so much better now. Of course, that could just be his new mystery whispering in his ear. Any necromancy he performed since earning Essence of Death had felt that little bit more natural, as if death was revealing itself to him. The process involved binding the spirit to the bones, something he had intuited. A spirit was a manifestation of magic, and magic could be molded into any shape when enough will was applied. To create a revenant, he had to pour their spirit into the skeleton like molten iron, fusing the ghost and the threads laced inside the bones together. Only then would the ghost have control over the remains. Was it strictly necessary to use the skeleton and spirit of the same person to achieve this result? Possibly not, but Tyron believed it was certainly much easier, and likely produced a better undead. After all, who was more familiar with Laurel's frame than Laurel herself? The first time he'd done this, Tyron had struggled mightily to control the process. But now, it was simple. He exerted his will and enacted the ritual, layering the two spells atop each other as he raised the dead and summoned the ghost simultaneously. Laurel's spirit wailed as he bound it to her bones, but he didn't so much as blink. Finally, he bound her mind in shackles of iron, using what he had learned to correct his mistakes from the past. There would be no rebellious fits from this revenant. She would obey unconditionally and never be able to turn her rage against him. When it was finished, light bloomed within the skeleton, inside the hollow sockets of the skull, and a brighter fire within the rib cage, the telltale sign of a revenant. It was there that the spirit was most concentrated. He bid his latest minion rise. You look good, Laurel. One of my finest creations, I must say. Wordless rage boiled through the connection he shared with the undead, but it was confused and aimless. Magically prevented from directing her emotions towards him, they floundered aimlessly, thrashing for something, anything to strike at. He handed her the bow he had prepared, made from reinforced bones and enchanted to produce greater speed from the projectiles it launched. It was an excellent piece of work. This is the best bow you've ever gotten your hands on. Hopefully it'll serve you well. Wordlessly, he ordered her to collect the quiver of arrows, which the revenant silently slung over her armor. She drew an arrow, knocked it to the bow, and drew back. A shimmering thread of purple light ignited as the hand came back, stretching until the string rested next to Laurel's bony cheek. She released, and the arrow whistled through the air for the barest fraction of a second, before it shattered against the stone wall. The ease at which the skeleton had moved pleased him greatly. The main advantages of a revenant was that it carried over at least some of the skills the spirit had possessed in life. Laurel had been a gifted archer from a young age. It was a shame she'd never made it to her first-class advancement. "You'll do," he said. It was too hard to keep the smile off his face as light swirled from the rock on the ground, so he didn't bother. The mist formed, and within, the shadowy form of Rufus's spirit. "Let me die," he raged. "No chance. I've got a use for you. It's about time someone did." The ghost thrashed and howled, twisting around itself as it tried to break free of the spell that bound it in place. The anger that burned in Rufus was so bright Tyron could almost feel it like heat on his face. It warmed him. "Do you have any idea how long it's taken me to fuse your stupid face back together? I didn't find all of your teeth, though, sorry about that. I've substituted some for you." "You're welcome." Did Rufus even know how he died? Tyron had never told him before. "I'm curious if you remember much of your death," he pondered. "That was the one and only swordsmanship lesson Magnan had ever taught you. A valuable experience, to be sure." "It wasn't you," Rufus rasped, taunting. I had you. And look at you now." Tyron clapped his hands sarcastically. "You've continued your winning streak in life." Suddenly, it didn't seem interesting anymore. Why was he here, taunting a dead man? Rufus wasn't just defeated, he was bound and broken, about to be enslaved. There was no benefit to it. "Speak to you again soon, Rufus." He waved his hands and ended the spell, sending the spirit back into the rock. When the ritual was complete, Rufus was entombed within his own skeleton, his will shackled just as tightly as Laurel's. He ordered his new revenant to walk up and down the study, keenly inspecting its gate to ensure the repairs had worked properly. Thankfully, everything seemed to be in order. Ignoring the rage and despair that thundered inside the undead, he handed a finely crafted longsword, the best Tyron had made, enchanted with a fairly basic form of hardening that would hopefully prevent the weapon from chipping, or worse, breaking. His bone-forged arms were yet to be truly tested in the heat of battle, regardless of what he'd done to them on his own, and part of him still didn't trust they would be durable enough to survive. "Give it a swing, Rufus," he ordered aloud. "Let's see how you move." His latest revenant slashed the air, unable to even contemplate refusing his commands, and Tyron was pleased to see the articulation of the wrists and elbows. His father had always emphasized how important wrists were for swordsmanship, though Tyron himself had never really understood it. Nevertheless, the range of motion was pleasing, and his latest revenant appeared sufficiently deadly. "A shame you didn't get more levels," he told his minion. "Eventually, you'll be replaced with better slayers. But I'm happy enough with this for now. Welcome to your new existence, Rufus." The spirit within the revenant was apoplectic with rage, but had no outlet for it. Externally, the undead stood as still and silent as any normal skeleton, though it looked much more impressive with its custom-made armor and brightly burning spirit fire. If not for the connection that allowed him to sense the emotions of the soul trapped inside, Tyron would have no idea how Rufus felt about his captivity. Ultimately, it didn't matter. To achieve his revenge, he needed powerful undead servants, and that meant revenants would inevitably be part of his retinue. Far better if he tested his techniques on the weak souls he had available, unranked slayers like Laurel and Rufus, than later, on actually competent people. Similar to Laurel, he dismissed Rufus and turned his attention to his next project. He didn't know the name of the slayer who had borne the shield in their conflict, though he could summon the spirit to find out. Tyron opted not to. Although this person had tried to hunt him down for profit, there was no real grudge between them. and he felt that taunting the souls of deceased foes may prove to be a slippery slope. Already, he found it difficult not to talk to his minions, despite repeatedly telling himself not to. Next, he'd be conjuring up the spirit of every slayer and marshal he killed to throw rocks at them. A waste of time. So he didn't bother. Instead, he focused on each step of the process in creating his latest revenant. He had 4 archetypes of skeletons at the moment: sword and board, sword only, spears, bow and arrow. Rufus would act as the revenant leader of the longsword wielders. He had Laurel for the archers, and now this nameless slayer for the more defensive of his minions. To emphasize his role, Tyron had taken great care in preparing this particular skeleton and its armor. The skeleton itself had almost doubled in weight due to the reinforcement he'd done, which didn't mean a lot in the greater scheme of things. Skeletons were exceptionally light, but the final result was much tougher than before. For the armor, he'd done similar, reinforcing the bone before compressing and molding it to the proper shape. This revenant would be the most heavily armored by far as well, with bone plating covering its entire chest along with thick, overlapping plates down the spine. Even the knee and ankle joints were protected, a touch which had taken far more time than he'd expected. When the ritual was complete, the revenant rose and he once again put it through its paces, watching with keen interest as the skeleton swiped its weapon through the air, or braced its shield while he threw bones at it. He was satisfied with the result. Now came the more interesting challenge. His ascension to a new class had brought with it a number of surprises, but foremost amongst these was his capacity to engrave spells upon the minds of his minions. It may be possible for him to create skeletons capable of launching death bolts or similar, but for now, he wanted to test this newfound ability on a mind more conducive to spellcasting. He intended to inscribe 2 spells upon his revenant, Death Bolt and Death Grasp, along with a much more elaborate enchanting array to gather the power necessary to fuel the magics. What he'd been able to glean from the hazy thoughts and impressions granted by the unseen had been dutifully recorded and expanded upon in his notebook, and he referred to them now, as he began to prepare the ritual. Raise Dead was already a difficult spell, at least comparatively, but by this time, Tyron knew it like the back of his hand. Modifying it even to this extent wasn't difficult for him, and he moved through the casting with confidence. Words of power echoed through the chamber as he wove sigils with his hands, forging a new, unique form of undead. When it was done, the revenant rose, hate and terror emanating from it in equal measure. Tyron pointed to one wall. Cast Deathbolt, he commanded. The soul bound within the revenant had certainly known how to form a normal bolt. Every mage did to some extent, but a death bolt? Absolutely not. Nevertheless, the revenant extended its skeleton hands, forming the arcane sigils with dexterous fingers of bone, and a mass of dark energy shot forth to smash against the stone wall. Wonderful, Tyron breathed. Chapter 151. It took longer than expected to collect these. I hope you weren't too inconvenienced. Yor asked with an arch smile. Tyron sat grimly in his workshop, the darkness only kept at bay by the small globe of light he had conjured. As grateful as I am for the service you've done for me, don't you think it would be more appropriate to send word of your arrival, rather than wake me in the middle of the night? Yor pouted and the necromancer averted his eyes. Evil things shouldn't look so appealing. It was wrong on a fundamental level. You can hardly blame me for waking you. I happened to come on the rare occasion you were actually sleeping. A very rare occurrence, wouldn't you agree? Tyron still preferred to work at night, even when he was enchanting. The lack of distractions was welcome, and he didn't struggle to fall asleep during the bustle of the day. The noise from the market was irrelevant when you could drift off to sleep with a spell at a moment's notice. More people should learn that spell. It was unbelievably convenient. No, I suppose I see your point. Are you going to deliver what you promised, or will I have to jump through hoops and a prolonged conversation I'd rather have no part in? If he'd noticed one thing about Yor and her coven, it was their propensity for talk. They could chat in circles around a topic all night without batting so much as an eye. He found it infuriating. What was the point of a conversation that didn't convey something? Yor insisted he simply wasn't seeing the nuance or reading the subtle signals. Tyron simply pronounced they were wasting time. The vampire frowned before she extracted a familiar wooden case from the shadows around her and passed it to him. As he reached out to take it, he realized she wasn't letting go. The box held firm in her grip. Of course, he sighed. Sure, we discussed the color red for 5 hours. while constantly hinting that we are talking about blood, but never specifically saying so. Despite his sarcastic tone, he didn't actually expect Yor to be angered by his words. But to his surprise, a bit of heat flashed through her eyes as she gazed down at him. The games we play serve a very specific purpose. The Scarlet Court is a place where an imprecise word, a poorly turned phrase, or a slip from the correct mode of speech will earn an eternity of suffering. My coven practices so that they may be in complete control of their tongues at all times, as it is the only way for a vampire to survive. Do you understand? She glared down at him as he remained seated in his chair. Tyron pinched his brow. I apologize. I know too little of your customs and ways to be passing judgment on your activities. Suffice to say, they do not suit me. But that is no excuse for my tone. She released the case, and he brought it close to his chest, nodding in thanks before he opened it to inspect the contents. Each of the glass spheres was now dyed black, the scent of death magic rising thickly from them. If he looked closely, he swore he could almost see the shifting souls wailing in despair locked within. Or perhaps that was just his guilty conscience. He snapped the case shut. Of course, this one isn't going to be free, or paid in a nebulous favor we demand later. You're announced. We have a task, though it will wait until after you return from your sojourn. In the dim light, she was a disturbing sight, her pale features standing out against her raven black hair. What stood out the most was her eyes, blood red and glowing with purpose. Was there a hint of fang in her smile? What do you need me to do? He asked. Whatever it was, it wouldn't be something he liked. This was a heavy favor he had asked for. They were sure to demand a price equal in weight. I warned you some time ago that other groups from within the court may soon seek to establish a presence here in this realm. Relatively stable and filled with blood, it's a tempting slice of reality for my kind, after all. Such an event has now come to pass. My mistress has confirmed it. We expect they may come to you, but we no longer wish to take that chance. You want me to go to them? Indeed. He really didn't like her smile. But we want you to survive, so we will call on you to perform this task for us after you have returned. I hope you are a little stronger at that point than you are now. Me too, Tyron muttered. I'm coming with you, Dove declared, hands resting on his bony hips. What? Why? Tyron stared at the skeleton, unsure quite what to make of this request. Is this a joke of some kind? I don't really have the brain power for it right now, Dove. The skeleton slapped a hand to his skull. A hollow tack sound reverberated through the study. Not enough brain power. What happened? You tripped over and lost half of your intelligence. I've got a lot on my plate, he snapped as he massaged his temples. I'm organizing the shop, preparing for the trip, managing my undead. There was also the many avenues of research he'd been feverishly scribbling out notes for, but he didn't see any reason to mention those. The more time he spent chasing his thoughts down each and every little avenue, the more Tyron became convinced that necromancy was an unmasterable pursuit. There were simply so many ways one could specialize. If he spent 100 years, he still didn't think he'd have time to ferret out every little secret, optimize each component of his craft. The moment he thought he had a solid grasp of one concept, he realized that his new understanding had applications in a dozen other places, and those changes fed back into what he'd been studying in the first place. It was endless, but his mind simply wouldn't allow him to put any of it to the side. He had to know. It's interesting the way you say trip like you're planning a jaunt into the central province for a spa day. I think a better phrasing would be horrifying journey through nightmarish unreality, or sanity-annihilating trek through a non-dimension filled with soul-devouring worms. It's more honest. Tyron frowned. Abyssals are worms. He'd never been able to ascribe a defined shape to them. To him, they appeared as an amorphous mass of tentacles and whatever they were made of. Of course, that's what you latch onto. No, abyssals aren't worms. Nobody knows what shape they are. The damn things start to disintegrate the second they arrive on this side of the veil. So it's not like you have time to take a good look. The necromancer knew that abyssal creatures couldn't exist in this reality, or anywhere outside of the abyss, but he didn't realize they perished that quickly. Why do they want to come through, then? They seem desperate to get to this side. I don't fucking know. The skeleton threw his bony arms in the air, exasperated. I'm not an expert on the abyss. The only reason I know as much as I do is because I'm Dimension Mage adjacent. Abyssals can't exist on this side of the veil. but they love to come over, melt themselves and kill everything nearby while they do. You don't seem to understand how terrifying they are. And yet, here's you, offering to accompany me on this journey through the abyss. For what purpose? To go to Cragwhistle. If I remember correctly, you described it as a frozen shithole on the arse of the world. Some of us like a good shithole. Tyron stared at him. You've changed, Dove. Not like that. Wait, you're the one making dirty jokes now. The fuck is going on here? The world has gone mad. The skeleton paced up and down, and once again, Tyron was disturbed at the sight of a skeleton moving with such human mannerisms. It was unnatural, like a sheep discussing the weather or a bird weaving fabric. Undead famously didn't have personalities, barring a rare few kinds. Watching Dove idly reach behind himself and scratch at the back of his pelvis, like he still had a backside, was simply jarring. Look, Dove fronted Tyron again. The reason I want to go is so I can throw some spells and kill some kin, alright? Far from clearing matters up, this only confused Tyron more. What? You want to kill kin? What for? He highly doubted that the reason was so Dove could relive his glory days as a slayer. Although maybe it was. We need to try and figure out how to connect me to the unseen, Dove declared, wiggling his skeletal fingers in Tyron's face. Neither of us know how to do it, but we both know it's possible. Your and her fellow suckers are proof that undead can still level and have classes. Of course. Why hadn't Tyron considered that as a possible motivation? You think if you kill enough rift kin, eventually the unseen will recognize your existence, grant you a class and race. What would his race even be? Revenant. Dove crossed his arms across his ribsage, the purple light flaring in his sockets. Obviously, the odds of this working are low. I know that, you know that, but I have to try. You don't know what it's like being cut off from the unseen, from power and independence. I've lived with it my entire life. In fact, I was silver, like you've become. Now that I can finally move again, thanks for that. By the way, I want to have a purpose. Apart from fighting the kin alongside my fellow bone boys, what else is there for me? If he was honest with himself, and Tyron almost always was, there wasn't much reason for Dove to continue to exist. As a mentor, he'd been invaluable, but that time had passed. Tyron now equaled the former summoner in terms of rank, if not quite in level. Were it not for the benefits of his formal mage education, Dove would have nothing to teach him anymore. Even then, at this point, there wasn't much he knew that Tyron couldn't figure out on his own. So we take you along and you can fight, kill a few kin, hope that you get a class somehow. Tyron sighed and shrugged. Fine, I'll take you along. Yes. The skeleton pumped his fists. But make sure you don't cause any issues, Tyron warned him. We both know you aren't at your most stable right now. He held up a hand to forestall any protest. And I don't blame you for that. I just can't afford any fuck-ups from you. There will be no skeleton running through Cragwhistle being a dickhead. You stick with the skeletons. Am I understood? Completely came back a solemn vow. Tyron didn't believe it for a second. Chapter 152. Pierce the Veil was one of the first rituals Tyron had ever learned. Unwieldy and mind-bendingly complex as it had been to him at the time, now he viewed the magic as a blunt instrument. Sometimes he wondered if the Abyss wanted any of those who contacted them with this spell to survive at all. In essence, all it did was manifest the veil, which was rather difficult, then poke a hole in it, which wasn't. After that, the ritual caster was pretty much on their own. The ritual circle was some protection, of course, at least physically. In reality, the mind of the caster was almost totally vulnerable to the psychic emanations of the Abyss, and almost certain to go mad. If the madness didn't win, then the opening in the veil almost certainly would. The creatures of the Abyss hungered to be free of that place. Tyron had felt that desperate desire from them, and the intensity of it had shaken him to the core. Why, and for what purpose? He didn't know, but it was certainly real. They wanted out, even if it meant death. Any opening in the veil was like lighting a candle at night next to a swamp. Insects rushed to the flame the same way the abyssals moved to the ritual site. Of course, the opening was small, only one could hope to get through. But what happened when one did? They, of course, would devour everything they could find, the first of which would be the one who had cast the stupid ritual in the first place. So Tyron had been forced to find other ways to communicate with the Abyss. That didn't involve offering himself up on a silver platter. Learning the rudiments of their speech had been the first step. Heavily modifying Pierce the Veil had been second. As it turned out, one could conceal the opening in the veil if you knew how, which had been very tricky to figure out. Also, it was possible to communicate with the creatures on the other side without allowing them through. Of course, they would hunt for the opening, which put the conversation on something of a clock, but it was possible. Using this method, Tyron had been able to construct a couple of deals. Hopefully, they would stand him in good stead now. Night closed around him tightly, but it didn't bother him. As requested, Mrs. Orton had allowed the construction of a small ritual site disguised as a woodman's lodge on the outskirts of her property. The necromancer had spent the better part of 5 days ensuring it was enchanted to his satisfaction. No whisper of the magic he conducted here could ever be allowed to leak. That had been the conditions placed on him, which he would have adhered to anyway. The less chance of his secrets leaking, the better he felt. Instead of drawing his ritual circle in dust, as he had the first time, the young mage had taken more conventional steps, painting the elaborate design on the smooth floor with a magically charged alchemical paint. When it was done to his satisfaction, he painted over it with a special, clear sealant. These components cost a fortune, but would be well worth it to ensure his defense was as strong as possible and impossible to disrupt. If all went well, he would be able to use this circle over and over again in the future, without having to start from scratch every time. Once the floor was completed to his satisfaction, Tyron turned to the walls. Soon, those two were covered in arcane sigils arranged in loops and walls, arrays into which he embedded cores to power them. Finally, he brought out the ladder and began the difficult task of painting the ceiling. Eventually, that too was completed, a complex enchantment that covered every centimeter of available space. Ever since Yor had accompanied him into the abyss, Tyron had never stepped foot into that place again. But to complete his aims, this time he must, and without her help. Owing favors to the vampires was becoming more and more dangerous. He could no longer afford to lean on them for anything he might conceivably be able to do himself. He could only hope he was as prepared as thought he was. So that's it then, Dove asked as Tyron stepped out through the heavy oak door and leaned the ladder against the stone wall. Are we ready to go? Outside the small building, under the cover of the thick foliage overhead, stood Tyron's full army of undead. Silent ranks of skeletal warriors armed with their weapons of bone, each with the glowing purple eyes of the dead. Almost there, he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. I have finished the circles. All I need to do now is affix the ritual focus, and we'll be as prepared as we can be. It'll be fine, Kid Dove assured him. I worked on those circles with you. They're as watertight as any I've ever seen. It'll be a piece of piss, you'll see. As much as he wished he shared the optimism of the skeleton-bound spirit, he simply didn't. The abyss was dangerous, deadly dangerous. It's not as if the Dark Ones or the Scarlet Court were particularly safe, but they were at pains to put a human face to themselves. Human-ish, anyway. Yor was terrifying, but she was like a kitten, compared to the real monsters who lurked in that realm of never-ending night. The old gods worked through their priests most of the time, which was a lot more comfortable than being summoned to stand before them. He could still remember how it had felt, those titanic alien presences looking down on him from a distance. He shivered. With the abyss, there was none of that, no kind face, no childhood friend, no gentle touch. Instead, there were only ravenous entities from a realm beyond realms, creatures of madness and hunger, who were inimical to life. We'll do it tomorrow, Tyron said over his shoulder as he re-entered the building to retrieve the rest of his tools and paints. It'll take a couple of hours to settle the focus. Then we can go ahead and cast the ritual. If all goes well, we can secure travel through the abyss and be out the other side by the end of the day. With great care, he began to store his implements away in the case he had commissioned for them. Each of his implements nestled into their own pocket of shaped velvet, the container itself enchanted against jostling and moisture. These tools would be needed when he got to his destination, desperately needed. Tyron didn't intend this to be a one-way trip, which meant he had to construct another circle on the other side in order to get back. Come on, surely we can do it tonight. A little more work and bam, it's done and we can get through. Tyron turned to glare at the skeleton. I'm the one casting the ritual, and I say tomorrow, I want to be fully rested before exposing myself to the abyss. Nothing less is acceptable. Are you trying to get us both killed? Dove scratched at the side of his skull. Technically, he began. You can't be killed. Yes, I get it, Tyron ground out. The skeleton picked at the robes Tyron had made him wear. Do I really have to keep these on? It seems kind of restrictive and unnecessary. You know what? I never understood people who preferred to go nude before, but now I'm starting to get it. Clothes are a prison. Free your mind, Tyron. Keep them on and shut up, the necromancer snapped. He flung himself into his bedroll. I'm going to sleep. See you in the morning. Fine. Be that way. When he awoke the next morning, Tyron yawned and stretched, thinking idly of the comforts of his home in the city. The store would be fine in his absence. Plenty of stock had been set aside, instructions had been given to the staff, and Flynn could handle the rest without Tyron looking over his shoulder. Hopefully. To the regular folk of the city, Lucas Armsfield was on a sabbatical, taking a rest after working hard to establish his business. He rubbed at his eyes before he turned to look at his skeletal army, only to blink when he noticed something out of place. Dove, he groaned as he kicked himself free from his blankets. At some point during the night, the former summoner had freed himself of his robes and dressed Rufus in them. Now he was probably hiding amongst the ranks, pretending to be a regular minion. This had become his new favorite pastime, and Tyron found it exceptionally irritating. With a thought, he commanded all of the skeletons to kneel, which they did instantly. One skeleton was a beat too slow. Soon, that skeleton had been seized and dragged to the front by the others. How dare you rise against me, your skeletal brethren? Dove howled. Are we not bone brothers, initiated in the ways of bone? This is a betrayal of the gravest kind. You'll all be dead by sundown. Dove, how in the name of all that is holy did you ever manage to get yourself onto a Slayer team? Second question, how did you manage to stay on one? The skeleton huffed and wrestled himself free of the minions who had deposited him in front of their master. Some people find my antics charming and humorous. No, they don't. It was mostly because summoners are rare, and I was good at it. I thought so. Dove re-robed himself and promised to behave, so Tyron opted not to tie him to a tree while he finished his work. The focus he had purchased for this ritual was specifically designed to channel dimensional energies, commonly used by summoners and the like, and by affixing it in place, Tyron could double its effectiveness. He'd no longer be able to use it for anything other than operating this specific ritual circle, but he had arrived at a place such luxuries were well within his means. After a couple of hours, he was done. He took some time to refresh himself by washing in a nearby stream, put on clean clothes and eat a hot meal, letting the food settle before he packed up the camp with Dove's assistance. Finally, all was prepared. Despite the dread that tickled at the edges of his mind, Tyron firmed his resolve. He had prepared well for this. It would go well. In one hand, he gripped the case filled with the soul beads, before he carefully placed it inside his inner pocket. He would need both hands for the ritual. With a final nod to Dove, Tyron stepped inside the stone building and closed the door behind him, locking it with an audible click. Light. He conjured a small globe and hung it directly overhead, before he took a deep breath and stood before the ritual focus. Without delay, he raised his hands and began to speak. The first syllable to leave his lips seemed to impact the air before him, as if reality resisted the push of his magic. But Tyron held firm, his hands moving gracefully from sigil to sigil, as his words continued to roll from his tongue. Gradually, resistance faded as reality began to bend to his will, and the ritual circle slowly began to flare into life. To manifest the veil was still a difficult process, and Tyron applied all his focus to ensure there were no mistakes, no hesitations or slips in this part of the spell. Eventually, the grey haze appeared before him, and Tyron moved seamlessly to the next phase of the ritual. Before the opening could be made, it must be concealed from the creatures of the nightmarish place. Deftly, he wove sigils and spoke the words of power, his every utterance now reverberating like thunder within that small room. Magic poured from him in an endless tide, as he weaved it with unmatched dexterity and skill. When he had bound this section of the veil with powerful arrays of concealment, he proceeded to form a needle of magic, one so fine as to be almost invisible, crafted to pierce the wall between this realm and the realm that was not. With utmost precision, he perforated the veil ever so slightly, creating an infinitesimal gap. Even this was dangerous. He could hear them already, the whispers tugging at his mind, daring him to come forward to reveal himself, and in return, they promised such secrets that set his heart aflame. Steadied by his protections, this was not enough to fray his resolve. Carefully, ever so carefully, he extended the ritual through the gap and into the abyss, seeking Arkarish, Theras, Shiranuzbulg. Barely a breath, he spoke these words into the abyss, repeating them like a mantra, over and over again, for hours. He held that gap in the veil, sweat dripping down his face as the abyssals began to swarm, catching scent of his world, until finally a voice spoke back. With a trembling hand, Tyron reached within his robe and took hold of the case. He opened it and extended it before him. For a moment, he heard nothing. Then he heard it, so soft as to almost be inaudible, so deep it rattled his bones, a sigh, filled with longing, with hunger. The tiny gap in the veil expanded in an instant, and for only the second time, Tyron stepped forward and into the abyss. Chapter 153. A haunted expression plastered across his face. Tyron stumbled from the small stone building. Dove tried to read the look in his eye, but the young mage was already collecting himself as he handed out silent orders to the gathered skeleton army. In neat ranks, they gathered their weapons and gear that remained in the camp, and began to file into the building, disappearing into the darkness within. "So you succeeded then?" he asked. "You've secured passage through the abyss?" Tyron nodded sharply. "It's done," he replied, his voice hoarse from the ritual casting, or perhaps from something else. "What about the Pridash?" "You don't need to worry about the price," the necromancer snapped. "Are you coming or not?" "Oh, I wouldn't miss it for a feel of Celine's backside." The young man could handle himself. Dove pushed his concerns aside and slid into line with the silently marching skeletal minions. It was disconcerting looking at them, knowing that he looked essentially the same as they did. It was hard to think of oneself as a skeleton. In his mind, he was still Dove, a scrawny, bearded human mage who summoned creatures of the astral plane to fight against the kin. Yet that wasn't who he'd been for a long time now. He jumped and clicked his heels together. He'd never been so light on his feet as a human. Even his substitute bones weighed an awful lot less than a full human body, which allowed him to move with surprising alacrity. It just felt so good to have a body again. His time as a head, at first semi-voluntary, then very much against his wishes, had been a nightmare he was unable to wake from, unable to move, to touch, to affect the world in any way. He was quite confident it had driven him mad in the end. Thankfully, Tyron had eventually gotten around to fixing the problem of not having a body. That is, Dove was fairly sure his mind would never recover. At least, it wouldn't return to what it had been before. As he passed within the small stone building, he swelled his bony fingers, letting the feeling of power, of magic, flow over them ever so briefly. Such a precious, limited supply he had, but there was so much he could do with it given the chance. All he needed was an opportunity to slip the leash. A puncture and reality, the opening to the abyss yawned before him. On one side, a dimly lit remote building, exquisitely drawn ritual circle, sealed into the stone floor, and on the other, nothing. And nothing so complete and total, so all-encompassing, it had gone all the way around and become something. Even so, it was still nothing. To his ghostly sight, it was just black, a void, and as he stepped through, that was all he saw. In his current form, he couldn't feel, he had no skin or flesh to assess temperature or pressure, but he felt confident that he wouldn't feel anything regardless. Not here. Along with the skeletons, Dove shuffled forward, finding a place amongst the narrow and dense formation. If he stepped too far to the side, he'd probably fall off whatever it was they were standing on. No matter how he tried to study the area around him, he couldn't get a read on anything at all. Not even the abyssals who doubtlessly swarmed around them at a distance. "Stay close to me." Tyron appeared at his elbow and began to stride toward the head of the group as Dove leapt to follow in his wake. "What's going on?" "We have a limited travel area." Whatever deal Tyron had negotiated with the denizens of this place, Dove had no doubt it was restrictive in the extreme. Anything that lived in the abyss wasn't happy to be here, but he imagined that led them to guard what they had even more zealously. "More limited than you imagine," Tyron replied tersely. The young man's eyes glowed as he maintained the ocular magic Dove himself had taught him. Is that even useful in here? He wondered. It allowed one to see traces and flows of magic. As far as Dove knew, there was no magic within the abyss. Not as he understood it anyway. "It is," Tyron confirmed as he watched their surroundings warily. "I had to modify it first." Of course you did. There's no magic here, except for what we bring with us. I knew that. But, if you know what to look for, you can detect changes in the stuff. Stuff. Is that the technical term you came up with? Fucking stuff. Try a little harder. Holy shit. Shut up, Dove. What do you call the soup of unreality that surrounds us? Huh. Unsoup. Fuck you. You're welcome. The two walked in silence, Tyron forging ahead, nervously glancing over his shoulder, as if to assure himself that his minions were still there. Possibly whatever allowed him to sense them was being interfered with in here. Or perhaps the magic was degrading over time. This wasn't exactly a healthy place for anything not born here to be, after all. Abyssals melted apart if they came through the veil. Perhaps it was similar for the people of his own realm when they trespassed here. The opening is just ahead. At least, it should be, Tyron muttered. Just like that, Cragwhistle. Here we come. Not quite, came the grim reply. Opening rifts in between a realm and the abyss is dangerous for everyone. I don't want to give it, he grimaced, as if remembering something unpleasant, any greater hold on us than we can manage. So where are we going? Dove was confused. Taking a slight detour, Tyron stated. We're going to appear on the other side of a rift, then travel to Cragwhistle. On the other side of a rift, Dove squawked. Are you serious? By yourself? Are you trying to get killed? Obviously not, Tyron frowned. Could have fooled me. What sort of fuckhead jumps through a rift by himself the second he becomes silver? You're out of your mind. The necromancer glanced behind him at the hundreds of skeletal minions. You think I'm going by myself? Those don't count. Dove raged. I've been through the rifts plenty of times, but only with a high-level team by my side. Dove, we both know you're full of shit. Some of the rifts are safer than others, even on the other side. A small, brand new rift like the one at Cragwhistle has an extremely low chance of attracting anything too dangerous. The biggest and baddest monsters can't fit through, so they don't bother with it. A low chance isn't no chance, Dove insisted. We could pop out and find ourselves squashed by a giant frost monster in seconds. What do you care? If you die beyond the rift, the chance you will bother trying to track your soul down is similarly low. I half thought that was the real reason you wanted to come out. Sneak off through a rift and get yourself flattened. That shit. That might actually work. You didn't even think of it. Tyron boggled at him. Dove waved his bony arms in the air. I've been too absorbed in being able to touch myself again. You can touch other things too, but why would I bother? I hate you, Dove. I hate you too. Tyron stiffened, eyes widening as he tracked something move around them. This is it, he said, voice suddenly tense. Get ready. The former summoner looked at him oddly until Tyron glanced back at him, uncomfortable. What? He asked finally. We could be walking into a combat situation, Dove reminded him. I know that. So why are you at the front? Tyron blinked, then took several slow steps back amongst the ranks of his minions. Dove cackled. Not exactly feeling like a brave adventurer now, are you? He hooted. You were a summoner. I bet you couldn't throw a rock and hit the front line your entire career, Tyron grumbled. Before either of them could continue to bicker, a rent opened in front of them, showing a desolate, frozen wasteland. Harsh wind blew, snow and ice slashing through the air. Yet Dove could hear none of it. Nothing came through into the abyss. Not a single snowflake. Here we go, bony boys, follow hard up my rear. So shouting, he leapt through the opening and into the freezing cold. For a moment, he almost braced himself for the cold. Long-practiced survival instincts told him he would freeze to death in weather like this, naked as he was. Yet the ice and snow chilled him not at all. It was liberating, in a way. A depressing reminder of his shallow existence in another. Behind him, rows of skeletons, followed by Tyron, began to emerge from the inky void. Dove scanned the area keenly, wondering if they'd stepped out of the abyss and into their own doom. But as far as he could tell, there were no kin nearby. Not that he could see very far. Whatever realm this was, miserable would be a gentle descriptor of the conditions. Storm clouds boiled overhead, thrashing and rolling as lightning flickered like a snake's tongue, cutting through the darkness in momentary bursts of blinding light. A constant barrage of ice, borne aloft by the wind, punched into him, forcing the skeleton to raise a hand to protect his skull from the onslaught. If the enchantments within were damaged, he'd be back to an immovable head, and he would not have it. Suddenly, he was overcome with frustration at how helpless he was. No magic sight to see the threats coming, no powerful summons, no enhanced physical body or mind. Nothing that had become so integral to who he was and what he did. The anger bubbled up within him so quickly he was almost shocked by its intensity. Here he was, beyond the rift, where he was supposed to be at his strongest, supposed to fight and win, yet he was almost helpless. "There's so much magic," Tyron called in disbelief. The young mage had put on his bone armor, and he looked severely intimidating, wrapped in black bone, rounded plates of the stuff covering his shoulders, and even a helmet of sorts on his head. "How far do we need to travel?" Dove yelled above the din, not wanting to talk about the power he couldn't touch. "Not far, I think," came the reply as Tyron tried to get his bearings. After spinning on the spot for a moment, he grunted and pointed a finger. "That way, about 3 kilometers. 3 kilometers. In this. What, are you cold?" Tyron himself was clearly shivering, despite pulling his thick cloak over his shoulders. Weak as piss, the necromancer chattered at his skeletal companion. "Do you see any rift kin?" Dove ignored the insult. Tyron nodded. "They're over there. We'll be putting my allegiance to the test shortly." Despite himself, a smile crept over his face. "I can't wait to see what happens." Chapter 154. As he watched his minions sort themselves into neat ranks, Tyron felt a surge of pride at what he had accomplished. The skeletons moved smoothly, with balance and strength. Despite having such a large group on the move, he was more than capable of supplying the magic required, proving his efforts in enchantment were paying immense dividends. Particularly here. As a mage, he was sensitive to arcane energy, and the way it filled this place was disturbing. Magic swelled and overflowed here, an abundance that felt suffocating, like a thick blanket pressed over his senses. It was warm and comforting, but no less dangerous than a blade to the throat. It was this power that had ruined this realm, destroyed all that had lived here, and that power now produced the Riftkin, sending them out to spread the contagion. Magic and the unseen, blessings and curses. "How far ahead, kid?" "I can't see a fucking thing. I'm as blind as a decapitated cow in a mine shaft." "Not far," Tyron replied, directing his troops. "You'll see them in a second." Responding to his mental commands, his archers formed up, notched arrows, drew their bows and fired. In the horrific wind, it was impossible to fire with any accuracy. But sheer numbers counted for something. The shots flashed out into the blizzard, less than half finding their mark. A trumpeted bellow of rage resounded, followed by others as more kin answered the call. The ground rumbled beneath their feet as Tyron focused, shifting his troops. Of course, he couldn't just focus on that alone. He had a role to perform that was greater than simply telling his skeletons where to stand. Words of power began to puncture the air as he formed the magic, hands flashing through the sigils he shaped with consummate skill. Death blades. Cast over a much wider area, the spell settled across his army as they braced. The moment he was finished, his hands began to flash once more, the next spell coming hard on the heels of the first. Through the storm came a mammoth, just like the one Tyron had faced outside the rift at Cragwhistle. The only difference was, this mammoth wasn't alone. Two more thundered forward behind it as Tyron's skeletons moved to intercept. Spears thrust forward as the light and nimble undead skated to the sides of the beasts, avoiding their charges, even with the sleet and snow, making the footing uncertain. Ethereal bowstrings thrummed, and another wave of arrows was fired, much more effective at such close range. He moved his archers like skirmishers, sending them forward, then scattering them as the rime-coated tusks of the mammoths swept in their direction. "Show me what you can do," he ordered Laurel forward along with his first mage skeleton. The first snatched an arrow from the quiver strapped to her bony hip, and fired it at a speed and power unclassed humans could never hope to match. Even without reaching bronze rank, Laurel had trained her skills and invested her feats wisely, it seemed. Alongside, the mage began to shift its hands, taking far too long to weave the simple magic. But eventually a death bolt was formed, the shadow ball of death magic streaking through the air to smack into a mammoth. The beasts bellowed in fury as the continual barrage of stinging arrows and spears began to penetrate their thick coats. They swung their heads, sweeping their tusks across the ground in wide arcs. That forced Tyron's minions to dance back, though they weren't always fast enough. Yet in the fight, propelled by his will, Rufus, or what remained of him, stepped forward, two-handed sword held tight in his skeletal hands. Alongside him, Tyron committed the rest of his longsword-wielding skeletons. As they surged forward, he finished casting his spell, flinging his hands down to point at the ground beneath his feet. Energy poured from him and manifested as a billowing cloud of black energy that spread rapidly. Tyron himself was quickly enveloped within as the cloud expanded. Already empowered by Stormwise, his cast of black miasma expanded with eerie silence and shocking speed. Soon, the cloud had encompassed the entire battlefield, blinding the living and eating at their flesh, while the undead were empowered, drawing in the energy to fuel themselves. Thankfully, Tyron himself was immune from the negative effects, otherwise he likely would have killed himself by casting this magic. "This is a good spell," Dove observed, looking around himself. "Didn't you want to kill kin?" Tyron asked him, then pointed. "There they are, go get them." "You want me to kill one of those mammoths?" "I don't exactly have a lot of firepower right now. Give it a shot. Otherwise, you could just stand around scratching your own backside, I suppose." "I don't have a backside, thank you very much," Dove sniffed before he turned and brought up his hands. Able to speak the words of power, he expertly wove a death bolt, following the patterns Tyron had taught him, firing the bolt of energy into the nearest target. The speed and power of the spell was vastly better than what his revenant had produced, and the necromancer turned and glared at the undead, who remained next to Laurel, firing the spell over and over again. Fueled by the miasma, the longsword skeletons charged forward, Rufus at the front. They descended upon the flank of an unsuspecting and enraged mammoth, leaping forward and sinking their blades up to their hilts in the creature's side. The beast immediately reared back, pulling several unsuspecting minions from their feet, before it wheeled and stomped down, but the skeletons were already gone. Pleased with the sight, Tyron couldn't repress a savage grin. The clumsy, stumbling skeletons he had started with were nowhere to be seen. His treatment of the remains was better. The weaving of the musculature and ligaments couldn't be compared. The extra magic the minions could draw on, and the improved raise dead ritual all combined to produce a transformative improvement. Now his undead moved with sure feet and rapid steps, their light frames carrying them over the snow and muck with ease. Unfortunately, as the minions fought, they drew on the miasma deeply, both to heal any damage and to fuel their movements, depleting the spell much faster than Tyron had anticipated. Briefly, he considered casting it again, but after carefully examining the battlefield, he decided against it. The mammoth beset by his longsword skeletons was faltering. With a thought, his archers switched targets, and began to pepper the ailing monster alongside Dove and his revenant mage. Unable to turn and face any foe without being exposed to another, the beast could do nothing but succumb to the death-infused blades of the skeletons. With one of the great creatures down, the skeletons charged at another mammoth, quickly overwhelming it before they turned on the last. Against overwhelming numbers, nimble opponents and the suffocating miasma, the mammoths were dispatched with minimal damage to Tyron's budding horde. "By the blessed bonds of the goddess," Dove exclaimed. "I can't believe how well that went. 3 of those mammoth creatures, and they were slaughtered. I guess it's true what they say about necromancers." Despite the victory and the welling pride Tyron felt, he didn't allow it to distract him. "We have to move," he chattered, suddenly reminded of the cold, now that the frenetic battle was over. "We still have a little way to travel before we reach the rift." Skeletons rushed back to form into ranks, while others began to carve through the remains. Tyron certainly wouldn't turn his back on cause if they were right in front of him. Despite the cold, he felt something from his minions, and took a moment to hunt it down. Unsurprisingly, the source of the disturbance was his new revenants. Resentment and anger swelled in each of them, though it positively stormed inside of Rufus. Unable to direct their rage at the cause, namely himself, they were left screaming within their own souls. A dreadful fate. Perhaps some were deserving of this existential torture. But how many who were not would he subject to this torment before the end came? That thought would have bothered Tyron once, but not now. Now, the answer was simple. As many as it took. When the cores were retrieved, Tyron finished forming his ranks, and proceeded to march forward to the rift, eager to be free of the cold. As he expected, the ice kin he had encountered before swarmed around the opening, trying to push through into the other realm. With his numerous minions, Tyron stormed through them, using the black miasma once more to cover the rift and secure the opening. He directed his undead to form a protective circle around him as he magically enhanced his eyes. Momentarily blinded by the surging arcane power all around him, he staggered and clutched at his head. "It's pretty wild, right?" Dove said from beside him. All the magic Tyron felt in his own world came from rifts such as this one. The amount of energy flooding through even this tiny rift was staggering. A torrent of power screaming through like an ocean forcing itself through a barn door. He had traveled through this rift once before, but Yor had handled the journey, fulfilling the agreement she had struck with Magnin and Beery. This time, he would have to manage it himself. As he stepped forward, Tyron felt as if he should have been swept from his feet by the raging arcane winds. But of course, they had no effect on the physical realm. His eyes told him the maelstrom existed, but he couldn't feel it. It didn't buffet or throw him from his feet. This close, the rift warped reality, bending space and perhaps even time in strange and unpredictable ways. It was a dangerous place to be, and he had no intention of staying long. Planting both feet in the snow and ice, Tyron thrust forward his hands and began to speak. Immediately, he felt as if he had slammed his mind into a brick wall. But he didn't allow it to perturb him. The words flowed smoothly from his lips, and his hands danced gracefully, shaping the power that poured out of him. Manipulating a rift in any way was fraught with dangers, but stabilizing it to allow smooth passage was a necessity. As each word was spoken, the air around Tyron resonated like a bell. Every syllable dropped like a hammer blow that he used to shape reality and bend it to his will. Bit by bit, a small pocket of stability began to take form around him, then extend, little by little, into the rift. All around, his skeletons fought without his direction, pushing back the riftkin who trickled toward the rift, drawn to it almost mindlessly. He tasked his revenants with fighting on the front line, hoping to preserve as many of his base soldiers as possible for the grind ahead. By the time he allowed himself to lower his hands, frozen sweat clung to Tyron's face, and his mind ached. But he had been successful. "You want to go first?" he asked of. Without a word, the onyx skeleton sprung through, whooping. The necromancer shook his head before he issued the mental command. His guard of sword and shield-wielding skeletons formed around him, and Tyron stepped forward, pushing through the rift and back to his home realm. According to Beth, Cragwhistle had gone through significant change since he had last seen it. He was a little curious to find out if she was right. Chapter 155. Treenan braced his shield tight against his flank as he drew back his hammer. Unheeding the danger, the Riftkin, a Frostghoul as the Slayers had taken to calling them, lunged forward, claws and teeth of ice coming for him. At the last moment, he stepped in, stuffing the attack with his shield and knocking the monster off balance. The claws scratched at him, but without weight and power behind them, all they could do was scratch his armor. As soon as space opened up, he tightened his grip on the hammer and swung it upward, controlling the motion and rotating his body, bringing the weapon up vertically to smash into the kin's jaw. Formed of ice, the head exploded, which forced Treenan to lower his head. The last thing he wanted was shards of ice in his eyes. Someone had already met that fate after enthusiastically smashing a frost ghoul while leaning too far forward. Thankfully, the rim of his helmet protected him from that terrible fate, and he kicked the now limp body of the creature away as he turned to assess the field. "How are we looking, teen?" he called. "Miserable. Cold. My ass hurts." "For fuck's sake," he muttered before he hardened his tone. "We are in the field, you slack-jawed dickheads. I swear if one of you gets killed mouthing off in the Broken Lands, not only will I paint 'I told you so' on your casket, I will piss and shit on the grave." "All right, Treenan, stop swinging your dick around." "We get it," Bridget said wearily. "We are clear of kin as far as I can tell." "Clear over here as well," Treenan Arthur said. "I swear my cheeks are about to freeze off." "Also clear," Chol called. The hammerman sighed and allowed himself a brief moment to indulge in self-pity. Believing promises made upon graduating the academies was a foolish act, and now he'd come to regret it. They'd be professional, they'd said. 100% serious on the job, they'd promised. Absolute horse shit. "We aren't far from the rift here, so stay alert," he warned them. "Only the gods know what might come through at any given moment, so be ready to run." Bridget rolled her eyes, then held her hands up when he turned to glare at her. "I get it," she said. "It's just, we haven't seen anything except balls and frost ghouls come through for weeks. It's hard to maintain the tension." With her dirty blonde hair pulled back in a tight braid and the freckles on her face, one could almost picture Bridget as a smiling village girl. If you managed to overlook the two-handed bastard sword slung across her back, and the broad shoulders and thick arms she sported. Talented, no doubt, but to lax. "Bridget, we are less than a month into our careers as Slayers, and already, You can't maintain the tension. How eager are you to die? Don't be so dramatic. She waved him off, still grinning. Never team up with your friends, he lamented to himself, not for the 100th time. It never works out well. 60% of Slayer teams lose a member before they reach silver rank. I do not want to be a part of that statistic, he said flatly. We know, Chol said as she walked up to stand beside him. And that's why we wanted to join your team in the first place. You want to be on this team. Fuck, could have fooled me, he grumbled. The dark-skinned woman grinned, flashing her flawless teeth at him. I know myself. Without someone like you kicking my poor frozen backside, I wouldn't last, and neither would my Arthur. We aren't married yet, Chol. I don't know if you need to say my Arthur. You said yet. That is enough. The mage ran a hand through his curly, dark hair as he gazed at his apparently fiancée. Are all people in the southern province so forward? He wondered. Or is it just you? A bit of both, she said. Would you two stop flirting and focus on the damn job? Trinan spat. The more the others dicked around, the more he felt like a claw was sliding around his throat. We've got another 2 kilometers to cover before we reach the rift. As the only team on the mountain today, we need to watch our fucking backsides. Clear what we can, observe the rest, don't die. Got it. Bridget snapped out the brisk salute. Got it, she barked. No matter how hard she tried, it was impossible for that woman to look serious. Go fuck yourself, Bridget. Let's move. Trinan took the point position, his shield up and eyes darting, as he surveyed the slope ahead. He trusted his team would fall into formation behind him. They usually did. Too many Slayers said they'd smarten up and take things more seriously once they reached silver. Those were probably the ones who didn't survive that long. Twice more, they encountered Riftkin on the approach, and with a combination of Bridget's heavy hitting, Trinan's defensive work, Chol's nature magic and Arthur's battle mage skills, they made quick work of the kin. The rift at Cragwhistle was only recently formed, not allowing many monsters through, and generally only small ones at that. Some of the teams had encountered bigger monsters, giant hairy beasts with tusks apparently, but only close to the side of the rift itself. A perfect training ground for a new team like the Hooligans. 500 meters, he called over his shoulder, trying to maintain his focus at its peak. If the team was going to find something they couldn't handle, it would be here. He risked a glance back over his shoulder, and was pleased to see the 3 fucksticks were focused for once, their expressions firm and eyes wary. It was a sight he so rarely got to see that he almost did a double take before he caught himself. If the team was doing their job properly, then he would have to be twice as dedicated. He refused to have them show him up. However, the rift was curiously inactive. As they drew closer, the lack of kin activity became increasingly unusual. Where were the packs of ice spores, or frost ghouls? Generally, there was always a decent number of them, either milling around the rift or forming into groups to charge down the mountain. Concerned, he signaled to the team to be on high alert. The lack of monster activity only heightened his caution, and he didn't want the others to loosen up. When he finally saw something, it was almost a relief. Then he realized what he was looking at. Was that undead? Sure enough, from behind a rock marched a skeleton, eyes glowing with a dark purple light, bare teeth grinning in the dim light. For a long moment, he froze in place, unsure how to react. Then the creature snapped its head around toward him, regarding the Slayer with eerie silence. Ah, Trinan. Has anyone mentioned undead coming through the rift? Bridget asked from behind him, her voice unusually hushed. No, he said. Something is very wrong here. If it was only a single skeleton. Before he could even finish framing the thought, another appeared, then another, then another. In a few seconds, the number of undead had leapt to over a dozen as they streamed down the mountain, moving lightly over the terrain towards them. Get the fuck out of here, Trinan bellowed as he turned to run. The others were already moving, but before they got more than a few steps, darkness overtook them, a billowing fog that blocked sight and burned their skin. Trinan didn't allow it to slow him down. He stumbled, tripped, fell, but continued to move as quickly as he could. He heard the skeleton coming, its bones clacking against the rock as it raced up behind him. When he was certain he wouldn't be able to outpace it, the hammerman firmed his grip, braced his shield and turned, trying to sense his opponent through the fog. Arthur. Chol. Light. He snapped. His footing was sure, his posture correct, as good a place to fight as any. I can't find Arthur. Chol called back, panic in her voice. Try to focus and give us some light, damn it. Trinan barked back. A second later, a dull glow sputtered into existence, suppressed by the dark cloud. From the gloom, a skeleton rushed forward, and he barely raised his shield in time before the sword of bone struck down. The blow held surprising power, but the hammerman was skilled with his shield and much stronger. He slanted the face, allowing the sword to slide off it, and prepared to swing his hammer before the undead could recover, but another one was already there. Another wide swing, caught on the shield, then another, keeping him on the defensive. Bridget, where the hell are you? He hadn't heard from the swordswoman, and that worried him. She was usually the loudest in a fight, whooping and hollering as she swung her weapon with deadly grace. She's indisposed, came an unexpected reply. A human's voice, a man. Who? In a blink, the burning fog rushed to the ground and began to dissipate, leaving Trinan blinking and uncertain. He brandished his shield and hammer as he tried to take in the situation, eyes darting wildly. He was surrounded. There were dozens and dozens of skeletons now, with more coming down the mountain. There must have been hundreds of them. There was also a man, young, not much older than Trinan and his team. Light build, dark hair and burning eyes. There were at least 10 skeletons between the two of them. Should he try it? I wouldn't bother, that voice was so cold. You wouldn't reach me. Besides, it would be a shame to break up such a new team. Bridget and Arthur, both motionless, eyes staring, were carried forward by a group of skeletons each before being stood on either side of this strange mage. What have you done to them? Trinan growled, trying to suppress his rising fear. Temporarily dominated their minds came the matter-of-fact reply. Those eyes still stared at Trinan as if trying to bore a hole through him. Now put down your weapons. You and the mage. Shoal allowed her staff to drop from her hands, her gaze locked onto Arthur. Trinan was reluctant, but lowered himself to place his shield and hammer nearby on the ground. He rose, his hands in the air. What you're doing is illegal. He tried to keep his voice steady, and almost succeeded. You cannot interfere with slayers in the performance of their duty. The man gave him an incredulous look, and Trinan realized how ridiculous he sounded. This mage was clearly beyond caring what was legal and illegal. Pointing it out was useless. I will tell you what is going to happen. I will take the weapons from the 4 of you. Then we will travel to Cragwhistle together. You will be held outside of the town while I contact a few people inside. Then I will release you to them. Understood. Trinan was shocked. You're going to let us go, he said. Shoal looked hopeful, latching onto the chance she might get her partner back. Of course. There's a rebellion on, after all. Young slayers like yourselves might just prove yourselves to be useful. Now let's go. Chapter 156. It feels so damn good to be out of that cold tire, and huffed as he shrugged his shoulders and wiggled his toes. His extremities tingled as the blood flow returned. I've got no idea what you're complaining about, Dove replied. I feel nothing. I'm numb and dead on the inside. And the outside, the necromancer grunted. I didn't remember the other side of that rift being that freezing the last time I went through. Did you do something to keep me warm? He waited for a few seconds, but Dove remained silent. Tyron turned to stare at him with wide eyes. You're going to let that go? He asked, incredulous. No sex joke, no mention of tits, nothing. Dove lifted his skeletal head and gazed off to the horizon as he scratched at his jaw. You know, Tyron, he said wistfully, people can change. It's wonderful and terrifying. The human condition, I suppose some call it. We can grow closer together, or further apart with the passage of time. What you knew to be true about me in the past may not be true for me now. I've undergone a metamorphosis, a fundamental alteration on a deep, spiritual level. She threatened you, or offered to free you. I refuse to believe anything else. Both, actually, the former summoner replied, chattering his teeth together for comic effect. It was a new habit he picked up. Tyron hated it. She said if I watch my words for a while, she'd let my spirit go when I decide to shuffle off, and said she would stuff my spirit into a urinal if I didn't. I'm a little surprised she didn't go for that in the first place. So was I, after she'd mentioned it. I had to ask, of course. She said it would have irritated you too much. Huh. The skeletal army, with its 4 slayer captives, continued its march down the slope toward the burgeoning town of Cragwhistle. Thankfully, no kin had emerged from the rift and overtaken them as of yet. But it was only a matter of time, so the necromancer was sure to keep himself surrounded with a protective wall of minions. Almost a shame my new armor hasn't been tested yet, he said, poking at the greaves wrapped around one forearm. I put a lot of work into this. You want to get hit? That's an interesting position to take. I don't actually want to. I'd just like to see how effective the armor is in combat. Testing it myself isn't the same as fighting in it. My advice: put it on someone else and let them take the hits. Not me. The last was added when Dove noticed the young mage glancing at him askance. I could make you your own set of armor, Tyron offered. All you'd have to do is test it out for me. No thanks, Dove rebuffed. I've actually got something to live for at the moment, which is a feeling I'd almost forgotten, so fuck off. Tyron grimaced. If Dove was feeling even a little more positive about his situation, that was probably a good thing. However, he couldn't shake the sense that the man had changed. The heroic slayer who died protecting him was long gone, twisted by the torment he'd been put through since the end of his natural life. Of course, that was largely Tyron's fault, but his former friend and mentor also bore some of that blame. I'll make you a set anyway. I can probably stash more enchantments for gathering magic on the bone, increase the pool you have to work with. That's generous of you, Dove replied, trying not to sound surprised. I'd appreciate that. The two continued to walk in silence. 24 meters ahead of them, the four slayers staggered forward, hands tied behind their backs, 50 undead positioned around them. With time and resources to work with, the necromancer class was starting to show its true worth, and he'd overcome the group with relative ease. Granted, he was above level 40, and they were all low 20s, but it was 4 against 1 after all. He'd been lucky there was only this one team on the mountain. Such a small rift didn't demand a full-time presence of slayers like the others, and there was the rather unique position it was situated in, which necessitated the kin take the only available path down the mountain. The monsters could, of course, travel across country and hazard the cliffs, rock falls and avalanches in the barrier mountains, but 95 out of 100 were sure to take the obvious trail that led to Cragwhistle. To the rookie slayers posted here, it must have been the easiest assignment they could imagine. Weak riftkin that funneled themselves down a narrow path. It was like they were being fed a buffet of experience. The only dangerous part of the assignment was having to climb up and check the rift itself every few days. Apparently, there's only 5 teams stationed in Cragwhistle, Tyron told Dove, and all of them are bronze, barely graduated. The onyx skeleton shook his bony head. The slayers are always stretched pretty thin, mainly because the strongest are encouraged to live in that birdcage. If things get any worse, the magisters might be forced to relinquish their grip and let more golds go out to play. In the absence of a move like that, a remote location like this is always going to be a low priority. I'd always heard that the slayer keeps closest to Kenmore were better staffed than places like Woodsedge, Undermist, Blackrift and Reynold for the most part. I spent a summer in Undermist, not long after I was out of the academy. I thought every keep was like that. How naive. When Cragwhistle came into view, Tyron had to stop for a second and take it in. Viewed from above, the town was barely recognizable from what it had been before. A stout wall of stone stood barring the mountain path, but it wasn't large enough to conceal the new buildings behind. The small village had grown to perhaps 5 times the size it had occupied before, dozens and dozens, perhaps over 100 chimneys peeking out of houses with lazy trails of smoke rising where there had been perhaps 2 in the past. It begged belief that this could happen in just a few years. Elsbeth had tried to tell him, but he hadn't really believed her. Holy shit, he muttered under his breath. After he took in the sight, he undid the binding that held his armor to his frame, and had his skeletons collect the components, before he stepped down the mountain to the 4 slayers. Clearly, Treenan was the leader, so it was to him Tyron addressed himself. I'm going to hold you here, away from the village town, until I've spoken to a few people. Don't try anything stupid. Just because I'm not here doesn't mean I'm not watching. Freed from his control, the swordswoman and Bat-Limage looked up at him sullenly, but they were the least likely to act out. Having one's mind dominated was not a pleasant feeling, and had he wished, Tyron could have implanted all sorts of suggestions. They did not want to experience that again. You'll get home safe and sound, he promised them, so long as you aren't stupid. If you are, with a thought, he summoned a Revenant, his first, to stand watch over the 4. You wouldn't be the first slayer who was made to serve after death. Do you understand me? We get it, Treenan said. Most of the bluster had gone out of him now. This was a young man doing his best to lead his team, only 19 or 20 years old. It almost made Tyron feel old. When he turned to stride down the mountain, he found a skeleton jauntily walking beside him, bouncing on his bony heels. Dove. Oh, fuck off. You're going to keep me out of town. Of course I am. You're a skeleton. Hell, you aren't even a skeleton. You're a ghost clinging to a facsimile of a skeleton. And people will not respond well if I approach the wall with you traipsing along by my side. Sit tight and wait. Perhaps I'll be able to get you inside the walls at some point. But by my bones and blood, it isn't now. The skeleton threw up his hands and petulantly kicked a stone. Fine, but I'm going to go annoy the shit out of the captives. Good, they'll hate you more than they hate me. Whatever makes you happy. So saying, he began his descent down the final few hundred meters. The wall was much better built than he'd initially supposed. Solid blocks of stone, each well carved and evenly laid, with good, solid mortar in between. Whoever had done the work clearly had levels and expertise in this sort of thing. Perhaps they were also the individual responsible, or at least one of them, for all the new construction. It didn't take long before Tyron was spotted by people atop the wall. Not slayers, at least he didn't think so. Villagers keeping watch, armed with simple bows, called out to him when he was still 100 meters away. Unperturbed, he held his hands above his head and kept walking until he stood before the solid gate, 4 faces peering down at him. Greetings, he called up to them. How in the name of fuck did you get up the mountain? A bewildered-looking older man called down to him. I've been here all day, and I haven't seen hide nor hair of you. I need to talk to Orton. He's expecting me. Can you send him out? Orton. The 4 consulted each other in hushed tones, before the old man stuck his head over the edge of the wall again. What do you need to talk to Orton for? I'm a friend of Elsbeth Renner. She sent me with a message for him. The priestess. You know her? For a long time. The man squinted. Hold tight. We'll send a runner for him. Much appreciated. Stay where I can see ya. I'll just take a seat on this rock if you don't mind. 8. It took 20 minutes before there was movement atop the wall, and Tyron saw a familiar face poke over the edge. Fuck, Orton half shouted. Nice to see you too. Not long after, Tyron found himself seated in a well-appointed tavern, though not to his uncle's standards, sipping on a mug of ale, as his old acquaintance stared at him from across the table. I told her you were alive, you know, Orton said at last, the big man looking slightly ridiculous hunched over the table, trying to speak quietly. I'm not sure she ever really believed me. Elsbeth, she probably knew from the start, given who her sources are. The townsman scowled and took a deep pull on the mug, casting a wary glance at the people on the tables around them. Compared to when he was last in Cragwhistle, the mood was almost positive, with cheerful faces and laughter echoing around the room. There was even a bard, or musician, more likely, plucking jaunty tunes on a lyre and singing. It was such a baffling difference it almost felt surreal. I'm not as positive about those sources as a lot of the people in town, Orton said. Seems to me almost everyone who's come in over the last few years is a member of a group I didn't know existed not that long ago. There doesn't seem to be much point in fighting it, Tyron said, considering who you're up against. What you're up against. If they want people to come here, then people will come. And they have. I can't believe what's happened here since I left. Since you died, you mean, the man said sarcastically, before he brushed his hair back from his forehead and leaned back in his chair. It's been a shitload of work, I can tell you that much. Feels like we've been balanced on a wire the whole time, but somehow things have had a way of working out when we needed them to. Enough food to make do, enough materials to get the next house built, enough wood to get us through the winter, the right tradespeople wandering into town at the right moment. Sounds like you have friends in high places, Tyron smirked. Orton slumped forward. That's what Elsbeth implied, but she would never come out and say it quite so directly. The necromancer shrugged. I don't have her manners. You aren't going to be able to hide your presence here, you know. The huge man leaned forward to whisper again. All these people, they've been waiting for a need for someone like you to come. They've been expecting it, said that their friends upstairs told them you would keep them safe. It was Tyron's turn to scowl. It's not like I can stay here and protect them from the rift forever. Besides, they have slayers for that already. I don't think that's the kind of protection they're talking about. He glanced around and Tyron almost rolled his eyes at how obviously conspiratorial the man was being. Someone this large shouldn't try and act so circumspect. He may as well have hung a sign over the table, saying these men have secrets. There's a magister in town, Autumn breathed. Came 2 months back, after Elsbeth left. Hot burning anger ignited in Tyron's chest, scorching his throat. He clenched his teeth and found his fists had tightened into knots. Slowly, he eased the tension, tamped the fire down. It wasn't yet time. He had to be cautious. Just the one, he confirmed, and Autumn nodded. He's been communicating by Rocklaw, he asked, and again, the big man nodded. Tyron sat back, his chin on his chest, pondering. After a minute, he looked up again, smoldering rage in his eyes. I'll need to meet this magister, he growled. Chapter 157. No matter what he did, the cold always managed to find Piranesi. It crept under his door frame. No matter how he covered the gaps, it swirled down his neck, no matter how tightly he wound his scarf. Despite the thick woolen gloves that he wore, his fingers still shook with it. In all his life, from downtown in Havercroft as a youth, living above his mother's dress shop, to his first post in the north, the Magister had never experienced such a persistent and insidious chill. Any attempt to flee or protect oneself against the frost only seemed to invigorate it. He was slowly becoming convinced the climate in this God's forsaken place was alive, tormenting him for its own amusement. No Magister had set foot this far from Kenmore in over 100 years. Perhaps the land itself had grown to reject his kind. Piranesi rubbed his arms and scowled. If Cragwhistle didn't want him, then the damn place would have to get over it. In a fit of pique, he'd committed himself to this posting. So now he was stuck with it for another 6 months, minimum. Luton, get in here, you miserable worm, the Magister bellowed. There was a timid knock at the door. Did you call for me, Magister Piranesi? Obviously I did, he roared. The walls are as thin as a caterpillar's anus. Don't pretend you didn't hear me. And how may I serve you today? That soft voice stammered from behind the door. Piranesi felt his eyes might boggle out of his head with rage. He tried to modulate his tone, but sounded as if he were being strangled around the neck. Get in here, Luton, he gargled. Excuse me, came the reply as the door slowly creaked open and the thin-faced manservant poked his nose through the gap. When he surmised that the Magister was somewhat calm, he relaxed a little and entered fully, standing straight, his hands clasped before his midsection. The way he shifted his feet ever so slightly from side to side, with an air that nobody could see him, reminded Piranesi of nothing so much as a mouse. It infuriated him. I'm cold, he ground out. Fetch more wood for the fire. And I want to see that oaf Autumn in here before the hour is done. Having dealt with the servant without resorting to threats of maiming or losing his temper, Piranesi was quite satisfied and sat behind his desk, intending to see to his papers. Cringing in the doorway, Luton, like an unwelcome fart, remained. I'm ever so sorry, Magister, he said, almost whining, but the villagers insisted they have given you more than double the normal household share of firewood. There is precious little to be had, and it isn't yet winter, so they are extremely reluctant to let people have too much. The mage slammed his hand down on the table, his expression twisted with rage. Those damn peasants, he roared, have no right to deny me anything. If I want their dead grandmother's corpse in my bed, they say thank you, sir, and clean my sheets the morning after. He grit his teeth and tried to calm his breathing. He'd been right to demand a Magister be sent out here. These people knew nothing of the proper respect due to his station, nor the authority he wielded. It shouldn't be surprising, this place hadn't seen an official of the Baron's court in gods know how long. As far as he'd been able to determine, no taxes had been levied here in 5 decades. And they were lucky if the marshals visited more than once a year. As isolated as an island surrounded by a permanent storm, Cragwhistle and other villages like it were more disconnected from the rest of the empire than Piranesi had imagined was possible in this day and age. The thought of these tiny pockets of surly, uneducated and illiterate people, unaware of their place within the greater workings of the province, let alone the empire as a whole, was baffling. At least here, all of that was bound to change. With the opening of a rift, slayers would come. When slayers arrived, magisters would come. The wealth extracted from the riftkin would bring merchants and traders, eager to collect the wares and transport them to richer markets, which meant roads, inns, stables and wagons. Slayers needed weapons, healing, entertainment and food, which would bring restaurants, taverns, hospices, brothels, farmers and more. With the influx of population, civilization would come knocking also. Taxes, law, a permanent slayer keep with an official residence for a magister. Of course, it would be decades before all of that was realized, but Piranus drew some satisfaction looking at the sullen faces of the people here, knowing their attitudes would soon change for the better. Go out there and return with wood for the fire, or I will burn you, Luton, he finally managed to say. Then I will go into the village personally. I will return with wood even if I have to tear it from someone's house with my bare hands. Understood. The servant nodded jerkily before he turned and rushed out the door, barely remembering to close it behind him in his haste. The magister sat still, his trembling hands laced together under his chin, as he struggled to regain his equilibrium. It hadn't been that long ago he'd been in council at the highest levels in Kenmore. Representatives of the major houses sat around the table with him. Due to his own temper, he was now here, in this frozen hellscape, trying to bring order and dignity to people who resolutely did not want it. Infuriating. Every minute and every day was infuriating. If it went on like this, he didn't know how much more he could take. After delaying and slowing his travel by as much as he possibly could, his arrival several months ago had felt like the knot finally being loosed on the gallows. Put it out of your mind, he spat, trying to invigorate himself. No point whining over it like a sewing girl with a pricked thumb. The stack of official documents in need of review was depressingly thin. Such and such a team with such and such as members sorted toward the rift report included. Such and such a team engaged in a defensive action outside the wall, fighting off kin, then collecting such and such cores and sundry resources, which were sold for such and such, with assistance from team who cares and team nobody important. With such weak monsters coming through the rift, only a handful of bronze teams were necessary to maintain the equilibrium. For a magister of his caliber to oversee the administration was an extravagant waste of talent. With a sigh, he diligently went through each document, noting the dates and intensity of each engagement along with the resources gathered. Regardless of how demeaning it was, Piranus intended to complete his role flawlessly, as well as engaging with his primary purpose, for coming to such a remote location. The rebellion, rumblings of it had been heard even in the capital, completely ignored by his colleagues. If evidence of such an uprising could be collected anywhere, it would surely be here. As of yet, he'd seen no evidence of any kind, hinting at an organized rebellion. The slayers here were young, barely out of the academy, and the bulk of the people were stone miners, shepherds and carvers, hardly the sort to attempt to overthrow the Baron. They might glare and spit behind Piranus's back, but that was simply because nobody had whipped them for disrespecting their betters in generations. All of that would change. He leaned back in his chair, papers momentarily forgotten as he gazed up at the thatch roof of his abode thoughtfully. The house had been donated for his use as an official residence and office upon his arrival, and despite being one of the best constructed in the village, it was woefully insufficient. There had to be evidence somewhere. Before he was done, he had to take something back he could shake under those idiots on the council's noses. Something that would stir them to action. Communications of some kind, proof of weapons being smuggled, or illegals fighting the kin. Perhaps he should go through the villages and see if anyone unbranded had been involved in the battles. Some of them had achieved a surprising number of levels fighting the kin, after the rift had opened, which had been revealed upon his arrival and collection of official status readings. If he were to perform another reading, perhaps he would shake loose a few people who'd gained more levels lately than they strictly should have. It was a thought worth pursuing. There came a soft knock at the door, and Piranus grunted, lowering his gaze back to his paperwork. "Come in, Luton. Throw it straight on the fire and then get out. I'm busy." Frequency and intensity of kin attacks on the walls seemed to be almost stable, and the reports from observing the rift itself suggested that it wasn't growing much anymore. If equilibrium had already been achieved, then that was a good thing. The province was stretched to produce enough slayers as it was. They were running out of grist for the mill, so to speak. For now, Cragwhistle would serve as an ideal training ground for weaker teams, before they would be sent to more established rifts. He scratched a few notes into his official records as the figure of Luton entered the chamber and moved toward the fireplace. For the most part, the ball-like king carried only the weakest grade of cores, and little in the way of useful components. But the ice creatures were better. Considering how weak they were, they tended to hold low 8 to low 3 cores, which were worth a decent amount for bronze teams. The Empire's hunger for cores was insatiable, and apparently, a few teams had begun to see signs of crystallized magic in some of the caves higher up the mountain, which could also prove profitable. Suddenly, Piranus reeled as something battered into his mind. He fell to the side, papers flying as his hands jerked and twisted against his will. He snarled, "You think I didn't know you were there? That worm Luton always shuffles his feet." The Magister fought to bring his body upright, pushing back against the weight that sought to smother his thoughts. He glared at the cloaked figure across the room, one hand extended towards the desk. At last, someone had acted directly against him. With a rictus grin twisting his features, Piranus slowly forced himself to standing, pushing back against the pressure, gaining ground millimeter by millimeter. "You and I are going to have a long conversation." After this, he ground out, straining with every fiber of his mind. The cloaked figure watched him, seemingly unperturbed that he was losing the battle of wills. A fool, then, trying to dominate the mind of a Magister. Piranus and his brothers were the masters of that game. Something blurred in the doorway, and he barely had time to recognize the flash of steel in the dim light, before pain erupted in his hand. With horror, Piranus glanced down to see 3 fingers had been severed from his right hand, rings still glittering on the lost digits. The weight on his mind suddenly doubled, and the Magister felt himself begin to buckle under the pressure. "A little harder, without the ring, isn't it?" the cloaked figure said quietly. The hand tightened into a fist. "Let's see how strong that will really is." Chapter 158. Tyron watched carefully as the Magister struggled to resist the influence of his mind. It was a desperate battle, will against will, as they fought for supremacy. Over the years, Tyron had become unfortunately skilled at this practice. Yor had called on him numerous times, and Tyron had been forced to manipulate several individuals, establishing his identity as Lucas Armsfield. However, this was a form of combat the Magisters were well versed in. Grimacing, saliva running down his chin, his opponent glared at him with a frenzied glint in his eye, his hands frozen into claws that hovered in the air. "Did you notice what it was that cut you?" Tyron said, keeping his voice low. "An undead. You know what that means. You've already lost, but it's better if you're alive, right?" Almost against his will, the Magister flicked his eyes to where the skeleton stood, bloodied sword still in hand. In that moment, his concentration wavered, and Tyron ruthlessly tightened his grip. Desperation crept into the fight as the wounded mage began to frantically thrash and claw at his mind. He knew the only way out was if he won this battle in an overwhelming victory, crushing his opponent before the skeleton could be ordered to injure him. Tyron allowed the Magister's increasingly panicked will to lash against him as he continued to squeeze. The anger blazed in him now, a roaring bonfire that crackled so loud as to drown out the rest of his thoughts. All he could see was the Magister. All he could sense was his mind closing like a vice around his foes. First, there was a slight chink, one brick in the wall cracking under the strain. But Tyron was upon it in an instant, driving his will through like a spike. The Magister tried to plug the gap, to rally what remained of his defense against the intrusion, but it was too late. Once the first chink had been opened, more soon followed as Tyron worked ruthlessly to widen them. When there was no way left to hold him off, the Necromancer wrapped his will around his opponent completely, blanketing his mind and suffocating it. He was now in total control. When he came back to himself, he found his entire body ached. His fists and jaw were clenched tight, a rictus snarl on his face, every muscle tensed and sore. Emotion had gotten the better of him. It was hard, seeing someone dressed in the robes of a Magister standing in front of him. But that didn't excuse his lack of control. "Have you got him?" Calm, a hesitant voice from outside the door. "Yes, I have him." The door opened, and the broad-shouldered frame of Orton ducked through. He really was too large for his own good. The Cragwhistle resident looked at the frozen form of the mage in wide-eyed shock, as if not believing the evidence of his own eyes. "When you said you wanted to handle the Magister, I didn't really believe you could do it. He's actually under your control." "He is, but he can still hear you," Tyron told him dryly. "Shit. You should have warned me before I came in. There's nowhere for you to hide now, so don't bother." I'm able to manipulate his thoughts and memories to a certain degree, so he won't remember this has happened. Not exactly, anyway. Autumn blanched when he saw the severed digits on the floor. "And how are you going to explain those with altered memories? Did he cut himself shaving or something?" The Necromancer reached down to pick up the fingers, and pulled the ring from each in turn, before dropping them onto the desk. He held up a black ring between his thumb and forefinger, showing it to Orton. Nasty piece of work this one. Helps protect them against mental intrusion and manipulation. Has a specially molded core wound through the center of it. Without removing it from his body, there's no way I could have won. That doesn't help you explain how you'll manage to prevent him from remembering it happening. The best lies have an element of truth mixed into them, Tyron said thoughtfully, tapping his chin as he considered the problem. Perhaps I'll suggest that it was a skeleton who cut his hand, a rogue undead from the plains, or someone recently deceased on the mountain. There's sure to be a few bony boys skeletons wandering around out there, considering all the death over the last few years. He looked over to Rufus, the Revenant standing guard over the frozen form of the Magister, and smirked. He couldn't help enjoying having him as a minion sometimes. Hopefully, he'd grow out of it. Now, we have a wonderful opportunity on our hands, Tyron said as he found a chair and pulled it over to the desk. With a flex of his will, he forced the Magister to sit, then eased himself down on the opposite side. We have a docile, controlled Magister here to question to our heart's content. There are limits to what we can force out of him, but I think this is going to be very enlightening. 6 months, Tyron muttered. I'm not sure if it's going to be enough. Orton looked at him sideways as the two settled themselves around the table in the larger man's home. You want to monopolize a rift for 6 months, and it won't be enough, he said. Just how many kin do you need to kill? Tyron flicked him a glance, a hint of irritation creeping through. I can't be here all the time. I have a persona, connections, and businesses to maintain. Not to mention that most of the materials I use to create my minions have been sourced from the capital. Kenmore is home to millions of people. Nobody is likely to miss a few skeletons there. Where am I going to find hundreds of remains out here, or the resources necessary to process them? He indicated towards the village with one hand dismissively, but Orton spoke to him seriously. If it's bodies you need, there are thousands out here, he said quietly, looking down at the table. Entire villages were wiped off the map after the break at Wood's Edge, and more have died since to disease and starvation. There's good reason why so many people have been prepared to up and risk everything to move out here. Tyron blinked, then nodded slowly. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't realize it was so bad out here. Elsbeth didn't mention. Orton frowned, then sighed. Well, I suppose she wouldn't. She's got a good heart, doesn't want to lay burdens on people they don't belong to. He stood and walked to his humble cupboard, pulling down 2 mugs and a bottle of red wine that he poured into generously. With one large hand, he pushed one mug across the table to Tyron, then gathered his own and raised it in a salute before taking a long drink. Hits the spot, he rasped. Bit stronger than I remember. Heck, they bottle this north of Cloughton, near Dustwatch Keep, Thorn and Sons Vineyard. I swear you can clean blood off the streets with this stuff. He took another pull while Tyron raised the glance and imbibed a cautious amount. The fluid burned his tongue and throat on the way down, tickling his nose. It was definitely strong. I'm not surprised no one in the capital is talking about it. They don't care, never have. Help came east, but not much further than Foxbridge. Rebuilding at the rifts up north is sucking up a lot of resources. The keep is about halfway done, and Woodsedge is starting to spring up around it again. This close to the barrier mountains, the big man shrugged. Nothing. I don't like to say it, but it really is a miracle we survived, even prospered, as well as we have. Under normal conditions, we'd have starved to death long ago. When it was said so plainly, Tyron saw clearly that this had been predictable, knowable, perhaps inevitable. With a little thought, he would have been able to see just how people this far west would have fared in the aftermath of the break. He thought of the farmwives and their children he'd saved from their horrible circumstances. So long ago, perhaps his only significant, heroic deed. Had they all starved to death along with the children, or fallen sick and perished for lack of medicine? It hadn't mattered to him. He'd been grieving and burning for revenge. Even now, he didn't care, not really. His sympathy for these survivors had peaked. He wouldn't fool himself and say it hadn't. But he didn't live to help people in need. Not anymore. He lived to enact vengeance, and he couldn't afford any distractions from that goal. Where would I find these bodies? He said finally, leaning forward. The big man scowled at him, then laughed bitterly. We can help you with that, I suppose. It depends on how open you want to be with your activities. I can have someone hunt down the mass graves for you. But the more dedicated people could probably be convinced to help you out, sort bones and the like. Of course, If you help us out, the folks here are more likely to chip in and keep their mouths shut. It didn't really matter if the people were willing to keep his secrets or not. Of course, it would take longer for word to spread if they were disciplined, but in the face of a noble or a significant member of the clergy, they would be helpless before the divine right. They'd sell their newborn baby before the command had finished ringing in their ears. Tyron leaned back in his chair as he thought. How greedy did he want to be? How much could he risk exposing himself? This far from Kenmore, it was tempting to simply drop the facade and finally be himself again, no mask. That impulse might be a trap. Walking around town with his natural face was one thing, even confronting the Magister without a facade was acceptable. After all, the number of people in the world who'd seen Tyrone Steelham at his current age, and known who they were looking at, could be counted on the fingers of one hand. According to everyone in the province, he was dead, a black mark on the family expunged by the sacrifice of Magnan and Beery, an event that occurred close to 5 years ago. Still, when the Magisters inevitably learned of a necromancer on the loose, would they believe it was someone new who had managed to slip the net, or would they immediately think it was Tyrone Steelham, who had survived unexpectedly? I'm not sure what you want me to do, Tyrone eventually said. My plan is to stay here and use the rift to gain experience and levels, though the process will likely be slow, now that I've reached silver rank. So you have made it to silver. I guess you'd have to be, in order to knock out a Magister the way you did. But as I said, I can't stay here permanently. I have a month before I need to go back to Kenmore, then I'll make, hopefully, another 2 or 3 trips over the following 6 months. Your minions don't have to leave, though, right? Autumn points out. Can't they stay and fight while you're not here? Tyrone frowned. Of course not. In order for them to move, I have to supply them with magic through a conduit. Moving such a vast amount of arcane energy over such a long distance would be impossible. I couldn't afford to have, I think. The necromancer trailed off, and Orton stared at him expectantly, then grew slightly concerned as the mage's eyes began to glaze over and stare straight through him. Hey Tyrone. Ho! He clapped his hands and the young man startled in his seat, his gaze focusing once more. What? Where? He stuttered, looking around himself in confusion. You spaced out there. Are you all right? Orton asked cautiously. Oh yes. I had an idea. He shook himself vigorously, trying to focus on the here and now, not allowing his mind to go racing down the thread he had discovered. Our main problem remains the Magister, Piranus. How is he an issue? Haven't you? Orton made an odd, scissoring motion with one hand towards his own head, fixed him up, so to speak. The big man was clearly uncomfortable with the idea. I haven't fixed him up. I've suppressed his thoughts and implanted false ideas to replace them. I'll have to check on him every now and again to ensure it doesn't break. But if all goes according to plan, he'll sit in that house for the next half year, filing paperwork and not setting foot outside, which means we can do whatever we like out on the rift. The issue will be when he goes back to Kenmore. Tyrone folded his arms across his chest and stared Orton in the eye. Piranus is supposed to be here for 6 months. When that time is up, he'll return to the capital and go back to his regular duties, and someone else will be sent. So you can just bamboozle the next Magister as well, can't you? Probably. My main concern is if someone notices that Piranus's memory has been tampered with. The Magisters are famously practitioners of mental magic. If they figure it out, we may all be in trouble. Orton slapped the table. Then shouldn't you have just left him alone? You've put the entire village at risk. I have, Tyrone admitted, glaring across the table. And I'll do what I can to protect you and these people, but I won't risk myself. I needed Piranus settled so I could access the rift regardless of what that meant for you and yours. He leaned forward. I am here to gather the strength I need to enact my vengeance, Orton. Anything that becomes an obstacle to that will be dealt with. Understood. The big man scowled. I get it. Chapter 159. You stupid bronze pieces of shit. Kneel before me. We are kneeling, you fucking donkey. Silence. Dove roared. I will not tolerate this disrespect. I am your new master, and you will obey my commands. The onyx skeleton pointed a bony finger at the 4 captives, glaring down at their kneeling figures with contempt burning in his burning, purple eyes. I was almost a gold-ranked slayer, he boasted, slapping himself on the ribs with both hands. You 4 are just puppies compared to me. If you behave yourselves, I'll tell my servant to treat you nicely when I'm not around. You'll get muffins. Maybe. He tapped his jaw lightly. What's the name of your team, anyway? Treenan scowled. The Hooligans, he muttered a little reluctantly. Dove stared at him. That's terrible. I love it. Dove, a cold voice broke into the conversation, followed a moment later by the cloaked figure of the necromancer. The four young slayers tensed as he appeared, and Dove threw his hands up with disgust. This is ridiculous. They're terrified of you. But look at me like I'm mildly irritating, as if I were indigestion, or old ham, or sour beer overripe cheese. Damn, I want food all of a sudden. You could shove some in your face, I suppose, Tyron said, voice wry. Not that you would taste it. He stepped closer and glanced at the captives. Why are they kneeling? He asked. So that they know their place, the skeleton declared, performing a rude gesture at the team. Tyron rubbed his temples and sighed. He'd hoped having a body and some basic magic would help stop Dove's slide into disturbing avenues of thought. At best, it had slowed him down slightly. He had a bad feeling that whatever was going on with his mentor would not end well for anyone. I'm sorry about him, Tyron said to the four, who clearly did not expect an apology from their captor. Tyron briefly considered how to explain Dove's behavior, then gave up and moved on to other things. All of you, stand up, please. Bridget, Arthur and Chol all looked at Treenan, who nodded, and the three of them followed his lead in rising to their feet, all eyeing the necromancer warily. For his part, Tyron was unafraid. Without their weapons and surrounded by skeletons, these four slayers were no threat to him. He considered for a while what he should say to these slayers to help them understand what was happening here, what he was doing. Perhaps he should make some attempt to bring them into the rebellion, turn them against the Magisters. According to Elsbeth, this was where the three wanted to make their stand, the hub around which the Slayer uprising would be founded. To this point, he didn't see it. The villagers were hard people, and no friends of the Empire. In fact, in the wake of the break 4 years ago, the common folk this far from Kenmore were openly hostile to the authorities. For the Slayers, it was different. Magnin and Beery, specifically, the way they had been used and killed by the Magisters, had been the final straw. After decades, centuries, of being suppressed and controlled, seeing their best and brightest being treated so poorly had exhausted their tolerance. But these four, they were fresh out of the academy, barely 20 years old. His parents had died before they had even awakened. Did they care? Unable to come up with answers on what to do, he had simply decided to ignore them. I will be here for a few weeks. In that time, I will monopolize the rift. When I'm done, I'll leave, and you can return to doing what you did before. They watched him silently. Obviously, I'm an illegal, he spread his hands, being open with them, a necromancer. You can attempt to report me, if you wish, but you might find it more difficult to achieve than you expect. Most likely, they didn't believe him. It didn't matter, trying to speak to Magister Piranus wasn't likely to go well for them. Not anymore. Whether you choose to believe me or not, I intend no harm to any of you, or the village. So long as you stay out of my way and keep quiet about my presence, you'll be fine. Treenan glared at him. What assurance do we have that any of this is true? He queried, despite the blonde swordswoman by his side digging a solid elbow into his ribs. Tyron shrugged. You're alive. If I wanted to kill you and raise you as my minions, I would have done so already. In fact, he stepped back into the waiting pack of shield-bearing skeletons. Once he was safely behind a wall of his minions, he had the Slayer's weapons returned to them. You're free to go, he said. Remember what I told you. Whether or not you end up like them, he gestured towards the revenant of Rufus standing to one side, depends entirely on you. Somewhat bewildered, the four accepted their gear, then stared as the skeletons stepped aside to allow them through. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, Treenan led his team out of the wolf's mouth, walking down the slope and back towards town. Behind them, the necromancer seemed to pay the Slayers no more mind, speaking softly to the weird skeleton. As the rest of the undead walked toward the rift, was he really going to hold off the riftkin all by himself? Judging from how many skeletons there were, it was possible. What the hell was that about? Bridget whispered. I thought we were dead for sure. Shut up, Treenan said, more harshly than he intended. We can talk once we get back into town. That mage is possibly gold, or high silver. We aren't safe to talk here. The others nodded and the group moved with purpose, tension thick in the air until they arrived back outside the wall. Hooligans, returning from the rift, he said stiffly to the men and women above the gate. Welcome back, Slayers. Got someone inside who wants a word with you. They exchanged glances, but there was a palpable sense of relief when they saw Orton Larigold waiting on the other side as the thick wooden gate swung open. We need to speak, urgently, Treenan said as he strode up to the enormous villager. Not here, Orton replied. Let's move to your barracks. Good idea, Treenan nodded. The other teams should hear this as well. The man nodded slowly. That too. When they'd arrived in Cragwhistle, the Slayers had been put up in a house, all that was available at the time. Since then, something had been built, far from a proper Slayer keep, but it was spacious enough to house the three teams, in what comfort a remote place such as this could afford. It was to this building, long and low-roofed, formed of grey stone, that the five of them walked. Thankfully, the barracks was close to the gate, otherwise Bridget may have exploded from the strain of holding in her words, long before she arrived. There's a fucking necromancer up the mountain, Orton. There's hundreds of skeletons, way too many for us to kill. The big villager blinked. That many? Damn. His reaction was extremely off-putting for Treenan. You know about this guy. What the fuck is going on here, Mr. Larigold? Can you keep it down, please? Someone called in a piteous voice. I've been drinking and would much rather be asleep than listening to you quarrel in the corridor. Treenan turned and thumped on his door. Well, you're shit out of luck, Gramble. Get your pudgy ass out of bed and get your team together. Some real shit is going down. Can't it wait until morning? No, you dumb fuck. Hurry up. Treenan glanced around. Where's Team Starfire? We'll get them, Chol offered, dragging Arthur with her. If they aren't in their rooms, I know their favorite place to be. Make sure you get everyone, Treenan told her. We need to work out what we're going to do. Orton simply sighed. Slayers often had their blood up, wanting to act decisively and be in control. He'd come to notice. It was probably a result of them fighting day in, day out for so long. Being indecisive was how you got killed. In short order, the Slayers of Cragwhistle had assembled. The 4 members of the Hooligans held court in the small common room inside the barracks, while the other teams found places to sit. Gramble had, with Treenan's assistance, dragged the other 2 members of his group, the Blue Dogs, out of bed, complaining loudly the entire time. The 5 women of Team Starfire had returned at Chol's urging, though unhappy that they'd been forced to abandon their meal. Their leader, Samantha, wore a perpetual scowl at the best of times. Right now, she appeared even more fierce. Did you call us all here, Mr. Larigold? She demanded when she saw Orton standing in one corner. I have all due respect to your position in the village, but wasting my team's time is something I won't tolerate. The big man held up his hands, palms out. Slow down there, please. It's true I wanted to speak to you all, but I'm not the one who dragged you all here. He stared pointedly at Treenan, who folded his arms across his chest and glared back at him. We have an urgent situation that needs to be remedied, so all of you can shut the fuck up with your petty grievances. There's a necromancer on the mountain, right now, as we speak. He spat out the sentence and paused a beat to allow it to sink in. A powerful one, too. He captured my team, disarmed us and held us captive before he let us go, told us to keep our mouths shut. Is this some sort of joke? Gramble wondered, pushing his glasses up his nose. A necromancer? Here. Do I look like I'm joking to you, Gramble? If I'm being honest, you look like you've never told a joke in your entire life. Good. Samantha shared a worried glance with her team. And he just let you go. I don't know much about necromancers, except that they're illegal, but I understand that turning powerful fighters into undead slaves is basically their go-to move. Treenan grunted, said he would leave us alone, leave the village alone too, as long as we didn't bother him. He wants the rift to himself for a few weeks. I'm not sure I believe it. Of course you don't believe it. Gramble laughed incredulously. He's probably trying to get stronger by taking on the rift before he wipes out the village entirely, killing all of us in the process. I, for one, am not going to sit around while this mage polishes a knife for my throat. Let's rally together and kill the prick. Most of the Slayers in the room nodded at this, but Orton spoke up, cutting through the rising aggression. I wouldn't do that, he said clearly, causing all the Slayers to turn and stare at him. Why not? Gramble demanded. We would be doing the people of Cragwhistle a great service, removing a clear and imminent danger. Besides, I'm not sure what say you have in our decision, with respect. Orton dragged a hand through his hair, frustrated, trying to work out how to phrase this diplomatically. Slayers had such sensitive egos at the best of times. For one, I think you would fail and die. There are hundreds of skeletons up on that mountain, so I'm told, and in total, there are 12 of you. I like those odds, Bridget announced. You didn't seem quite so confident on the mountain, Arthur muttered. For two, Autumn pressed on, the villagers here would likely turn on you if you did, which you would not survive. The big man grimaced as the faces staring at him grew decidedly more heated. Are you threatening us? Samantha asked coldly. No, and I don't want to speak on this much. Suffice to say that the necromancer is known to the people here, and they will not take kindly to him being hurt. The main reason I wanted to keep this conversation quiet was because I don't know how they'll react once they find out he's here. But if you try to go up the mountain and fight him, I will tell them. We can prevent that, Samantha growled. Something close to pity flickered across Orton's face. No, you can't, he said quietly. Upon graduating the academy, each and every one of them had been given the brand. In that moment, Treenan could feel it, searing like the day the cursed thing had been carved into his flesh. There's nothing stopping us telling the Magister, Treenan said. He can send a message by Rocklaw, have a team of Silver Slayers here, to rip the bastard's head off before the week is out. You're welcome to try, Orton said, but I warn you, it won't work. Are we really going to sit here and listen to this villager tell us what we can and can't do? Gramble said, staring around the room. Fine. If that's what you all want, then fine. Me and my team will not remain while some madman we are permitted to kill sits on the mountain. We'll pack our things and be on our way in an hour. He made to stand up, but again, Orton spoke before he could. I'm afraid you can't do that either, he said reluctantly. Gramble turned to glare at him directly. Why not? He said slowly. Because the Magister would write you up for dereliction of duty, ruining your career. Your 3 teams have been posted here directly. You aren't free to leave. Treenan didn't like what he was hearing. Why would Magister Piranus do that, Mr. Larigold? He asked. You seem awfully confident he'll do whatever is convenient to that necromancer. Suffice to say, those two have had a confrontation, which the Magister lost, Orton said, shifting uncomfortably. Any attempt to turn Piranus against the necromancer will not work out. Mind magic. Gramble gasped, horrified. That's monstrous. And what they did to us isn't. A voice grated out harshly. Shocked, many of the Slayers, including members of her own team, turned to stare at Samantha, who scowled back at them, fire in her eyes. Anyone who doesn't resent the brand, put your hand up, she spat. Seconds ticked past in total silence. Nobody raised a hand. That's what I thought. I'm not happy about this situation, but I'll jump through a rift naked before I feel sorry for one of those bastards. A hush descended over the group as they each considered what they should do, until Gramble, the pudgy mage, had had enough. This is ridiculous, he declared, pushing himself to his feet. I refuse to believe the people of Cragwhistle are behind you on this, Mr. Larigold. It's absurd, and I'm going to prove it. He began to march toward the exit as Orton stretched out a hand. Don't do that, please, he called after him, but without physically restraining him, there was nothing he could do. The others looked at each other before they too rose from their seats, and began to file out of the barracks, wondering what Gramble was going to do. Full of ire, the mage boldly stepped out into the middle of the street, threw up his hands as if he were a circus performer, and loudly declared, Good people of Cragwhistle, I must inform you of a real and present danger. This obviously garnered attention, people turning from what they were doing, poking their noses out of shops. There is a vile necromancer on the mountain, Gramble shouted. The Slayers watched in shock as the people heard what he said, then turned to the mountain. A great cheer rose in the chill air. Chapter 160. There was something refreshing about being on his own again. The city was filled with distractions, noises, and concerns. He had to wear many faces, be many things to many different people. Until he had stepped away from it all to make this trip, Tyron hadn't truly realized how exhausted of it all he was. Pulling so many strings at once was a difficult feat, and he found himself glad to be able to put them all down, untangle the knots in his mind. Are you going to stand around staring at the trees? Or are you going to kill some shit? Dove said, prodding him in the side with a pointed, bone finger. It was almost peaceful out here. That's it, I'm putting the armor back on. Tyron brushed the skeleton away. before he found the armor he'd constructed. A brief ritual later and he was once again covered in the molded bone plates, protected from the kin and irritating undead slayers. Come on, Dove urged him. The sooner you get to fighting, the sooner I can deathbolt some kin in the head and see if I can start earning levels again. It's unlikely, Tyron began, for the umpteenth time. Yes, 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 Dove waved him off. We all know that it probably won't work. No need to bring down the mood, you fucking killjoy. A slim chance is better than no chance, right? Let me have this. Fine, he conceded. There was no real reason to continually squash Dove's dreams of regaining his power. But he really didn't believe it would work. As far as he knew, the power of the unseen was tied to blood. How? He didn't know, but the status ritual itself was proof enough. If more evidence was needed, then the blood capsules he'd received from your being able to change his status was sufficient. Although he paused for a moment, although the capsules changed the way his status was read, it didn't actually change his capabilities in any way. None of his unseen granted strength or knowledge was removed, nor the aid of his mysteries. Perhaps the status was read from the blood, but existed somewhere else. It was an interesting line of thought, but not why Tyron was here. You can have a few here and there, he warned the skeleton, but I need the bulk of the experience for myself. Of course. I'm not some greedy little rat begging for more scraps than they deserve, Dove said indignantly. I'll behave, you'll see. Tyron grunted, unconvinced, but didn't waste more time with the former summoner. He was finally here, with a chance to fight, experiment and gain experience, an opportunity that had taken years for him to create. He refused to waste it. Hopefully, the kin have started filtering through again after we cleared them from the other side, Tyron mused. Of course they will, Dove assured him. Rifts will always draw in kin, especially if there are not many hanging around it. All they want in life is to jump through and kill shit. Why is it that everything not living in this realm wants to take a chunk out of it? Tyron said. Don't be ridiculous. The realms that have fallen to the rifts attack others without rhyme or reason, but the fact that they exist at all speaks to the existence of worlds beyond this one. I'm sure there's gajillions of worlds out there, probably in the same boat as us, fighting off the kin and trying to preserve what's left for their people. Then why haven't we ever found any? You'd think after thousands of years of fighting the rifts, we would have found a way to contact another world, cooperate with them against a common enemy. Dove shrugged his bony shoulders. Fucked if I know. Dimensional magic has found ways to contact all sorts of places, such as the astral sea, or the abyss, and a bunch more nobody gives a fuck about. But not other realms such as our own. I have, Tyron mused. You what? I've contacted another realm like ours, sort of. The skeleton stared at him. You're talking about the Scarlet Court, aren't you? Tyron nodded. From what we've been told by Yor, it's a realm that was taken over by the vampires, and turned into a blood and darkness paradise for their kind. Who's to say that it wasn't once a world like ours? That's actually really interesting, Dove stroked his bony chin. Something to think about another time. For now, let's go kill shit. That's what we came here for. Right you are. There were too many interesting thoughts bubbling away in Tyron's mind. He'd need time to sort through them, but for now, he directed his minions forward. After 6 hours of fighting, he would retreat back to a familiar cave for the night. Against the frostboars and ice walkers that Tyron had first battled against 4 years ago, his minions proved more than up to the task. Watching his massed ranks of skeletons tear the kin apart filled Tyron with satisfaction. This was the potential his class had held from the beginning. A necromancer was a powerful weapon against the rifts, and he was now the proof. His shield minions formed a solid wall, absorbing the force of the boar charge, stabbing back with icy calm, while his archers fired and longsword skeletons flanked. With the overwhelming numbers he brought to the fight, very little damage was suffered by his undead during the fighting. The roaming packs of boars, even when supported by the stronger ice kin, were simply not enough to match his minions even with minimal spell support. As night fell, he arrayed his minions around the cave that had been his resting place once, 4 years before. Better prepared this time, Tyron laid out his supplies, creating a cozy and secure environment. A padded bedroll lay on the flattest ground, which he covered in leaves. A crackling fire was quickly lit in his enchanted fire pit, with added temperature control. In a move that left Dove speechless, He even revealed a foldable table and chair, which he quickly arranged, unfolded his notes, and began to scribble away in. "You aren't exactly roughing it, are you?" the skeleton said, incredulous. Tyron continued to make notes. "I don't see any reason why I should. I have the ability to purchase or make better equipment, so I did." Did Magnan and Beery travel with all this luxury? I always assumed they enjoyed slumming it like the rest of us. The young mage hesitated, his memories causing the pain to spike in his chest. "They traveled pretty light," he said roughly, then coughed to clear his throat. Ahem. At their level there wasn't much they couldn't do for themselves. Magnan was so physically durable he could sleep on the point of a spear, and Beery could heat or cool a tent, start the fire, conjure water, whatever was needed. That's what I thought. Shame to see that child living in such frivolous comfort. They wouldn't have cared. They'd be more likely to praise me for planning ahead, something they always struggled to do. Well, enough of this pointless sentimental garbage. I killed 3 kin today. Let me have some paper so I can perform the status ritual. Tyron rolled his eyes, but handed over a sheet of paper nonetheless. He didn't bother telling the skeleton he was unlikely to have success without being able to bleed, but he also didn't tell him about his suspicion about the power of the unseen. He had too much on his plate to worry about without the skeleton pestering him for more favors. "Come to Dove, you wordy prick," the mage cackled, holding the paper in his hand as he danced his odd skeletal dance. Trying to ignore him, Tyron turned his attention to his own matters. On the page in front of him, he had a short list of things he needed to resolve regarding his own build, sooner rather than later. They were: subclass, general feats and skills, necromancer progression. Despite thinking on it for some time, he was no closer to selecting a subclass to pursue. As a human, he had access to a third, and he didn't want to waste it, especially since Anathema had taken a precious slot. Alchemy was a viable path, another source of income that may unlock more ways to strengthen his skeletons. But Tyron had reached a point where he could simply pay an alchemist to perform that service, or at least provide the materials. Some sort of general or leadership class. Would such a thing even work on the undead? And how would he go about receiving it? Unlikely Lucas Armsfield would be able to sign up for a military or militia. There were many different mage classes that tempted him. Summoner, Elementalist, Dimension Mage, Curse Mage, all of them seemed viable. Irritated, he turned his attention to the next line item. He had general feats and skills that he needed to select. Not as powerful as those stemming from classes. They were still extremely useful and deserved careful thought before selection. Tyron had so little time to devote to such matters recently, but he was determined to make his choices before leaving the mountain. Third and finally, he needed to map out his progression as a necromancer as best he could. Synthesizing what he knew about the class, he wanted to try and visualize a path for him to reach his goals. Thinking about what he wanted from the class had helped him select Lord of the Ossuary when he'd ascended, and Tyron had come to see the clarity that focusing on his purpose gave him as an asset. Speaking of which, it was about time he performed the status ritual once more. After raising so many undead and fighting through the rift, he was sure to have earned some levels. Probably not as many as he hoped. Progress slowed to a crawl once reaching silver. It was famous for it. There was a good reason so many slayers, the majority of them, were stuck between level 40 and 60. Either they died, stopped pushing themselves to break through to gold, or retired. Not something his parents had ever worried about. The two of them had breezed through silver, or so he'd heard. They'd done it long before he was born. Grasping a sheet of paper, Tyron enacted the ritual, looking forward eagerly, as his blood took shape on the page before him. Numerous messages relating to his skills, and a good number of improvements to his core abilities appeared, which was of course very welcome. Bone Animus, Forging and the Raise Dead ritual had all increased, which was gratifying. His hard work raising his minions had been rewarded by the unseen. Anathema, oddly enough, hadn't moved, though the message he received from the Dark Patrons was generally positive. Tyron's eyes glided over the text relating to the Abyss. He wasn't ready to think about that yet. Then came the notification about his primary class. 3 levels. 3 very welcome levels. It was honestly more than he'd expected. Many slayers grinded hard in difficult rifts for years in order to reach gold. Tyron wasn't so naive as to think he would be able to breeze through in a matter of weeks or months. But 3 levels was enough to earn him a new ability, the first from his new class. His eyes quickly scanned down the page, eager to see what his new class was going to offer him. The first selection for a class was often a powerful one, key to how it would grow over the 20 levels. When his eyes landed on the text, he hesitated, surprised. Lord of the Ossuary has reached level 42. Select from the following spells. Summon the Ossuary. And nothing. Tyron leaned forward, confused. He picked up the page and turned it over, wondering if the words continued on the other side for some reason. They didn't. Select from what? He muttered. There's only one. As far as he knew, he should have been offered a second ability. There was always a second ability. Perhaps this was something different that only started happening at silver and higher. A little disappointed, Tyron leaned forward and placed his mark. At least I can't make the wrong choice, he said to himself, and ended the ritual. Immediately, his eyes rolled back in his head as a flood of information was rammed into his brain. In 5 seconds, it was over, and Tyron lurched forwards, catching himself on his table at the last second. Holy shit, he gasped. Mind still a jumble. He steadied himself, wondering what the unseen had just done to him. He took deep breaths, steadying himself until the dizzy feeling went away. When his head was no longer swimming, he began to prod at his own mind, trying to tease out details of what he had just learned. So soon after the ritual, all he could get were hints. But what he learned was enough to make his eyes widen with shock. This is, he stammered. A pause. Holy shit. This is the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you for your supportive comments. Have a wonderful rest of the day. The Silent Ruptors out.